The Silk Roads were never a single straight road, but overlapping route networks that changed with terrain, season, and power. Relay exchange was possible, allowing goods or animals to pass between different groups along a route before continuing through another regional connection. On difficult stretches, people sometimes walked beside the laden animals because loads and terrain constrained movement together. Resupply and rest shaped the pace without imposing one exact schedule, and that made the road less a march than a sequence of managed passages. That pattern gave merchants room to adapt to road conditions without pretending the route was fixed in advance. The trade world depended on those handoffs, each one carrying cargo farther while leaving the route itself open, uneven, and tied to the practical limits of the land. Across these routes, travelers and goods moved through connected regional corridors rather than one uniform road. They were practical halts, not luxury inns, and food and water gave them their clearest purpose. A caravan could pause there before taking up the next stretch, resting within a built place that helped movement continue. These stops gave trade a steadier rhythm because the road had to be organized around the needs of people and animals alike. The journey advanced by replenishing as much as by traveling, and that made the caravanserai a reliable point of pause between more demanding sections. It also helped animals recover, and that mattered as much as any wall or roof for riders and pack animals alike. It turned the uncertainty of the road into a sequence of workable stages. Markets drew those arrivals into exchange. Travelers could sell what they had brought, buy what they lacked, and resupply for the road ahead. In towns, those transactions tied long-distance movement to local demand, so buying and selling depended on what residents needed and what the caravan could offer. A market therefore joined distant travel to ordinary urban life, and that connection gave the final stretch of the journey a new direction. Town exchange could involve selling, buying, and resupply before travel continued through the wider network of connected routes. The exchange was ordinary, but it was also the hinge between arrival and departure itself. By the time a caravan moved on, the road itself had already been altered by the town's appetite and the traveler's next need. Overlapping corridors joined distant regions while preserving distinct local routes, conditions, and patterns of exchange. A merchant might carry goods across one segment, then release them into another set of hands as animals and cargo moved onward. Regional corridors varied across passes, plains, and road clusters, with each shaped by local conditions and traffic. Their connections depended on geography, nearby settlements, and the movement that each region could support, so the network joined different local systems without turning them into one standardized road. Those distinctions remained part of long-distance exchange at every scale. On some corridors, overland movement worked beside rivercraft, so freight shifted between pack animals, wheels, and boats as conditions changed. That flexibility mattered because the network was built from connections rather than from one continuous track. It allowed movement to be divided into practical stretches, each one short enough to be managed without forcing every load through a single impossible passage. Merchants did not need to master the full span from start to finish. They could handle one stretch, turn goods over, and rely on another carrier for the next stretch. That arrangement fit the way the roads actually worked, because a route could change terrain, available transport, and local customs within a relatively short distance. Even the goods themselves were chosen with that pattern in mind. Compact, valuable cargo traveled more readily than awkward bulk, and the movement of animals matched the length of each segment. A caravan therefore advanced by stages, not by a single universal rule. In that sense, the Silk Roads were less a line than a sequence of working links. Way stations and markets gave the network its practical shape. They broke a long journey into workable segments, and each segment had its own resupply, rest, and transfer points. A caravan that arrived at such a place did not have to continue unchanged. Caravan stops supported rest and resupply, and some could also serve as transfer points between different carriers. That was the real usefulness of the stop. It turned a long, demanding crossing into a chain of manageable movements. Travel on the Silk Roads depended on that chain, because no caravan could ask every beast to carry the full burden across every terrain, and no load could remain untouched by change from beginning to end. The station linked the road with nearby exchange and resupply within a wider commercial setting. Markets were not an extra feature added after the fact. They belonged to the system, since the road had to be supplied as it moved. In this setting, the pause was not wasted time. It was the condition that made the next stretch possible. A load might arrive by one corridor and leave by another arrangement, which is why these places mattered as much as the roads themselves. They kept movement orderly whenever terrain, animals, or distance would otherwise have slowed it. Loads could be prepared for onward travel according to local transport needs and available regional connections. Those route nodes mattered socially because people with different lives met there in ordinary business. Settled residents, nomadic groups, and traders speaking different languages came together at the same points, not as one blended community, but as a working overlap. A caravan stop could bring local producers, itinerant carriers, brokers, and animal handlers into the same economy of movement. High-value cargo was especially suited to that world because it could pass through successive hands along the road, with each hand responsible for one segment before the goods moved forward again. Such arrangements allowed long-distance exchange to continue through successive regional connections and different participating groups. Trust traveled with the cargo through repeated transfers and through familiarity with the next reliable link. A merchant at one node did not need to know the whole road in detail to profit from it. Knowing the next handoff was enough. The road therefore worked as a social system as much as a geographic one. It connected communities through contact, transport, and exchange, while local languages and customs remained distinct. The movement continued because adaptation was part of the bargain. This was why adaptable intermediaries mattered so much. They could read one market, accept one burden, and release it again when the next carrier was ready. Their role kept circulation steady across different communities, so a bundle of goods could move from node to node without requiring every stop to look or sound the same. Packing animals was a matter of balancing weight, distance, and the demands of each segment. Caravan travel depended on resupply, rest, and transfer points because no animal could carry a city's worth of trade in one continuous push. Loads had to be divided so that movement stayed steady and flexible. Compact, high-value goods fit this system well, while bulkier cargo had to wait for the right station, the right carrier, or the right river corridor. The same principle shaped the route itself. On some lines, overland movement worked alongside rivercraft, so freight shifted between beasts, boats, and human hands as the journey changed form. A caravan was therefore assembled in pieces. Each piece had its own limit, and each limit kept the trade within reach of the animals that made it possible. The road did not ask for heroic endurance from one load carried non-stop. It asked for order, timing, and a careful match between burden and passage. That practical balance mattered every day because a load packed for one stretch might need to be broken down or transferred before the next stretch could begin. Movement remained possible only when the cargo, the animals, and the route were fitted to one another. This is why the network favored smaller divisions of responsibility over total control. Goods could pass through successive hands or carriers as routes and regional conditions changed. The packing itself already contained the logic of the road. At the eastern edges of the road world, Tang art preserves horses and Central Asian contact together. That pairing matters because the caravan system carried more than cloth, spices, or bullion. It also carried animals, skills, and people whose presence belonged to the wider culture of exchange. Horses were especially important, since they shaped transport, status, and long-distance movement. Their prominence at the edges of the network shows that the animal was not just a tool of loading and carrying, it was part of the social world that the roads sustained. The same edge zones show contact as something ordinary rather than exceptional. A frontier did not have to mean separation. It could mean adjustment, where familiar forms met unfamiliar ones and continued in altered shape. Caravan routes worked in the same way. They connected places without erasing the differences between them, and they left room for local practice while carrying outward signs of connection. The horse imagery associated with Tang culture belongs to that larger pattern of exchange, where movement itself had cultural weight. Central Asian contact joined people, animals, and goods, though its surviving depiction does not establish an everyday travel routine. These edges were not empty margins, they were active points where transport, identity, and exchange touched one another and kept the route alive. They also show how road culture reached beyond one language group and into shared habits of travel and exchange. When the loading was finished, the road already had a direction of its own. The caravan did not carry the whole Silk Roads in one body. It carried only the next workable stretch, then left the following stretch to another set of hands. That is why segmented movement, repeated transfer, and mixed transport mattered so much. They kept the journey within the reach of animals and the people who managed them. Markets and stations gave the system enough order to continue, while settled, nomadic, and multilingual communities supplied the human links that tied one segment to the next. The result was a form of travel that valued preparation as much as forward motion. A packed load was not the end of the story, but it was the point at which the story became possible at all. From there, goods could continue onward through a chain of known arrangements, and the road could keep opening in usable pieces across the wider world. By the time a caravan moved on, it had already depended on many small agreements made along the route, each one practical enough to keep the load from stalling. It was a system of practical handoffs, not a demand for one continuous burden, and that is why it could link distant places without turning every mile into the same kind of work for animals, carriers, and goods alike across shifting terrain from one segment to another. That order made the first stage of travel feel settled. Along the Silk Roads, the land around the road decided what could move and how. In open stretches and on firmer ground, carts could take the load, while in rougher places, camels, asses, or pack horses made the harder passage. Camels mattered, yet they were only one transport option among several, not the answer everywhere. Mountains asked for different footing than deserts, and roads with better surfaces opened room for wheels or for smaller beasts that could keep a steadier pace. The corridor was never a single track with one universal rhythm. It changed with slope, water, and the strength of the surface beneath it. A merchant who understood that pattern did not think first of a favorite animal, but of the ground ahead and the weight that had to be shifted across it. Each stretch rewarded a different choice, and that practical choice shaped what could travel at all. The Silk Roads were less like one grand road and more like a long set of linked passages, each with its own rules for carrying silk, grain, metal, or whatever else was worth the effort of movement. Different routes and terrain could favor different transport animals without implying one fixed sequence, interval, or timetable for changing between them. Regional transport choices remained shaped by local conditions, available animals, and the practical demands of the route being traveled in each setting. That flexibility was part of the system because the cargo mattered more than the creature carrying it, and the creature could change as the landscape changed without breaking the journey from one stop to another. That choice of beast was never only a matter of convenience, because carrying power set a hard ceiling on overland trade. A caravan could only move what animals and wheels could bear, and that limit shaped both the size of shipments and the kinds of things worth sending across long distances. Heavy cargo was costly to drag, so trade favored goods that were valuable, compact, or worth waiting for. The load itself became part of the price of exchange. When merchants joined a moving line of animals, they sometimes walked beside the laden beasts rather than riding, which kept the animals available for work and left the precious carrying space to the cargo. The arrangement was practical, not ceremonial. It showed that the human body could be asked to share the pace of the train when the train mattered more than comfort. On a long road, such choices helped decide whether an enterprise stayed profitable or became too expensive to continue. Every additional animal changed carrying capacity while also adding practical transport constraints to the movement of a caravan. That is why transport in the Silk Road's world was never just a background detail. It was the framework that determined how much silk, metal, spice could be shifted, and how far a merchant could stretch the effort before the expense outran the return. In that sense, the road was not merely a path through territory. It was a moving calculation about weight, distance, and the limits of muscle. Larger ambitions had to fit inside the strength of the convoy, or they stayed on paper. The route's real strength was replacement. Pack animals could be changed as conditions shifted along the corridor, so a convoy did not need to keep the same beasts from start to finish. A stretch of firmer road could favor carts, while a narrow climb might call for asses or pack horses, and a dry crossing could make camels the better choice. What mattered was not constancy, but adaptation. A load that began its journey on one creature might finish on another without losing its place in the caravan. That kind of handoff turned the Silk Roads into a sequence of practical decisions rather than a fixed line of motion. It also made long-distance movement possible across regions that would have broken a more rigid system. Each change in terrain asked the same question again: which animal could carry this weight with the least waste of strength? Because the answer changed, the caravan changed with it. The result was a transport world that rewarded flexibility and punished attachment to a single method. In that sense, the corridor linked not just cities and oases, but working habits. People along it had to know when to keep moving, when to shift a burden, and when the ground itself required a different kind of carrier. Over time, that habit of replacement became part of the road's ordinary logic, as familiar as the dust under the feet of the animals themselves. A journey did not fail because one mode was absent. It adjusted, and the adjustment was the point. That kept overland exchange alive where fixed arrangements would have stalled instead. Tang horse imagery belongs to contact zones, not to a single caravan type. In the eastern reaches of the route, horse figures and horse-centered decoration point to places where Chinese tastes met steppe and oasis worlds, and where the horse carried status as well as freight. The image says contact, exchange, and shared style, not a universal transport plan. It also warns against flattening the whole corridor into one animal and one way of moving. Camels were important, especially in drier stretches, but horses had their own place in the traffic of people, goods, and prestige. A road that touched many ecological zones could produce many kinds of transport culture at once. That is why horse imagery matters here. It marks meeting points, not a single caravan model. The Silk Roads were a network of varied practices, not a stock picture with one repeated silhouette. On some legs, a camel was the sensible carrier. On others, a horse or a smaller pack animal fit the ground better. The art of the period fits that same variety. It shows that travelers and traders moved through connected worlds without turning those worlds into one uniform system. Even the most familiar image from later imagination can therefore mislead if it is allowed to stand for everything. The corridor was broader, rougher, and more adaptive than that simple picture suggests. Its presence across objects and styles reflects a world where movement linked court, market, and frontier without erasing their differences, so the horse became a sign of connection rather than proof that every caravan moved the same way at all. All of that kept the Silk Roads from hardening into one romantic picture of endless camels. The overland world was broader than that, because carts, camels, asses, and pack horses each answered to different ground, and each could be useful in the right stretch. Merchants did not build a caravan by habit alone. They built it by weighing terrain, load, and distance against the strength of the animals available. That is why the road's history is really a history of choices made under constraint. A route through mountains asked for one kind of carrier, a dry crossing another, and a firmer road another still. The caravan changed with those demands, and the change itself was part of how exchange survived across so many zones. When later artists and viewers reached for the horse, or for the camel, or for the long line of animals, they were reaching for only one piece of a larger system. The system was broader, less tidy, and more elastic than any single image. It kept movement possible by refusing to stay the same from one stretch to the next. So the pack line moved forward, not as a fixed parade, but as a working answer to shifting land, and that practical answer carried the story onward into the next stretch of road, where the same attention to ground and weight would matter again, because the caravan's life depended on matching load to landscape before any distant exchange could matter, and on keeping the moving line adaptable enough to cross another change in terrain cleanly before the route asked for another adjustment. At the start of a Silk Road's journey, packing was already a judgment about distance, value, and weight. Textiles, foodstuffs, tools, metals, and religious items all traveled across varied Silk Roads, yet no caravan simply carried everything available. Transport space constrained what merchants chose to bring, so each bundle had to earn its place. Compact goods had advantages, but compactness alone was not enough. Value had to justify the labor of moving it. A heavy object could be sensible if its worth was high enough, while a larger and cheaper load might fail the same test. Packing, therefore, worked as an early sorting of trade, separating freight that suited the road from freight that did not. The choice was practical rather than ceremonial. It linked weight, bulk, durability, and expected return into one calculation. Long inland movement rewarded restraint, because every extra bundle used up room that could have held something more profitable or more durable. In that sense, the caravan was being shaped before it ever left the settled edge of the route. Each animal could carry only so much, and each load had to fit both the length of the road and the value that road might preserve. The result was a freight pattern based on selection, not abundance, and a convoy became a disciplined answer to limited carrying space. Such packing gave the journey its first order, turning mixed merchandise into a workable load and a workable load into the beginning of exchange. That discipline mattered because the road favored objects that could travel, survive, and repay the strain of distance over long stretches. Packing decisions only made sense inside a built corridor. Watchtowers, way stations, caravanserais, and water systems supported movement through route corridors, tying difficult stretches into a sequence of usable stages. The road was organized, not empty. Shelter, supervision, and water lessened the burden on people and animals, and each support point made the next one possible. With that network in place, merchants could risk freight that was heavier, denser, or more valuable than bare survival would require. Road freight still had to be compact and durable, but it no longer depended on a single exposed trail. That difference mattered because road freight followed different rules from urban markets. In a city market, many goods could stand side by side for comparison and purchase. On the road, the first test was whether the load could survive movement at all. The market prized variety on display, while the caravan prized selection under strain. A support corridor did not erase limits of space or weight, yet it made them workable across distance. Water and shelter let traffic continue where a lone path would have broken into short local moves. Predictability followed from that structure. Traders could commit more value to freight when the road promised recovery points along the way. The caravan then became an organized instrument of passage, not a drifting cluster of pack animals. Its freight remained selected for endurance, but the route itself widened the practical range of what could travel. In that sense, infrastructure did more than assist movement. It defined the scale on which exchange could happen, and it made long journeys less dependent on chance than on preparation. Not every load belonged to commerce alone. Travelers and objects moved for commercial, diplomatic, and devotional purposes, and those aims could overlap in the same journey. Some freight was meant for sale, some for exchange between powers, and some for ritual use or pious offering. That wider traffic helps explain why caravans carried more than market goods in a narrow sense. Cloth, foodstuffs, tools, metals, and religious items all belonged within the moving world of the Silk Roads, even though no single convoy carried every category at once. Tomb and collection objects point to these categories of goods rather than to a fixed caravan list, which matters because the road connected many forms of exchange without freezing them into one pattern. A convoy could therefore serve merchants, envoys, and devotees at different moments along the same corridor. The same path that moved profit could also move status and reverence. Diplomatic, ritual, religious, and commercial motives could share roots while remaining historically distinct from one another within the same wider exchange network. Overland transport gave such objects a reach that local exchange could not match. Their movement mattered not only for what they were worth, but for what they represented. In that sense, the caravan was a social instrument as well as a commercial one, carrying relations between communities along with the material things that expressed them. The load on the animals thus belonged to a broader order of contact, where exchange, obligation, and devotion could all move through the same route system without becoming identical. Because goods changed hands along the route, a caravan's load rarely stayed identical from one stage to the next. Some items were divided, some were combined, and some moved onward in fresh exchanges that altered the cargo before the journey ended. That flexibility was not a side effect, it was part of how the road worked. High-value objects justified the labor of difficult overland transport when they were compact enough to survive travel and valuable enough to repay the strain. The road, therefore, rewarded concentration of value. A caravan could carry fewer pieces than a city merchant might display, but those pieces could be chosen for the long return they promised rather than for sheer number. This made adjustment essential. A load that began in one form could emerge in another, thinner or denser, as opportunities appeared along the way. The caravan was not a sealed container rolling unchanged across the map. It was a working chain of transfer, and each transfer shifted the balance of what the animals bore. The practical logic was plain: protect space, preserve value, and keep the freight worth the road. Some compact, high-value goods traveled far, while surviving material cannot define a universal rule for other cargo categories. That is why a convoy could change shape without losing purpose. Its usefulness came from adaptation rather than from preserving the first bundle of goods at every stop. In a connected corridor, the route itself created markets for repositioning freight, and those shifts helped explain how long-distance trade could continue without requiring every cargo to remain fixed from beginning to end. Seen together, these patterns show that the Silk Roads depended on choice as much as on movement. Packing turned mixed goods into a selective load. Support corridors of watchtowers, way stations, caravanserais, and water systems gave that load a route it could survive. Commercial, diplomatic, and devotional purposes gave the journey a social reach beyond simple buying and selling. Exchange along the road kept the cargo from remaining static, and high-value objects made difficult transport worthwhile. The caravan was therefore not a drifting heap of merchandise. It was a disciplined form of passage, built around limited space and changing value. In the settled places at either end of the route, goods might sit in fuller display, but on the road they had to earn their place in motion. That difference made the caravan a bridge between distant centers, carrying selected things across terrain that demanded planning and restraint. Its freight answered to weight, endurance, and worth, while its route answered to water, shelter, and the spacing of support points. Each part depended on the others. Once those judgments were made, the convoy could continue into the wider life of the Silk Roads, where freight, people, and obligations kept moving through connected corridors. The journey did not end with loading, and it did not begin with abundance. It began with selection, then moved through support, exchange, and purpose until the caravan had become a workable shape for distance. From there, the road carried it onward into the ordinary pace of travel, where the balance of animals, goods, and route would matter again and again in every change ahead. Along the Silk Roads, trade often changed hands before any caravan reached its farthest destination. Successive merchants replaced one another along the route, so ownership of a load could fragment as it moved. A bale of cloth, a bundle of metalwork, or a package of valuables might pass from one carrier to the next, each transfer joining a longer chain of exchange. Relay exchange made that pattern workable. Each traveler covered only a local leg, then handed the goods onward to another merchant whose own contacts reached farther across the corridor. The road therefore depended on succession rather than on a single uninterrupted march by one household. It joined short commitments, allowing exchange to extend across successive regional connections and participating groups. Packing mattered because the animals had to be loaded for the next stretch, not for some imagined all-at-once crossing. The people who organized those transfers understood that the route itself divided labor. One set of carriers moved goods across one reach, another across the next, and the merchant remained one participant within a wider chain of exchange and movement. The road made commerce out of passing things along. It also taught a practical habit of checking what could move together, what should wait, and who would bear the next burden when the current leg ended. That division of labor made the corridor legible to merchants who never expected one owner to control every mile. It also made the exchange resilient. That is why the route could remain open even when no single merchant knew the whole distance, because each transfer carried forward only the next practical responsibility. Geography reinforced that pattern. The corridor crossed valleys, deserts, and steppes, and sectional travel followed those different landscapes. What looked on a map like one continuous line was, on the ground, a set of demanding stretches with different distances, grazing, water, and shelter. Load and animal had to suit the leg ahead, since what worked in one place could be awkward in another. Packing was therefore a matter of adapting goods to the next segment, not of forcing every bundle toward a single standard. The caravan could move along a mountain path, a dry crossing, or open grassland according to what that portion of the route required. Relay exchange fit the terrain neatly because each traveler needed to know only the local conditions of the leg ahead. In that way, the road was less a single highway than a corridor of practicalities. One could pass from valley market to dry expanse, then into steppe, without any one method staying fixed for the whole distance. The order of the pack shifted with the requirements of narrow passes, water stops, and open crossings. Narrow burdens made sense on steep ground, while more open country allowed different arrangements. Practical choices were not only about speed, they kept the load balanced, the animals serviceable, and the next transfer possible without waste. Terrain trained packing to answer the land, and the land kept revising the answer. A caravan that crossed such ranges learned to think in segments, since every stretch demanded a different arrangement of bodies, bundles, and responsibility. This made the road durable in places where no single carrying method would have fit every mile. Across those moving segments, Sogdian networks helped organize exchange. They linked communities from one end of Eurasia to another, making it easier to place goods into the hands of the next carrier and trust that the transfer would continue. That connective work did more than move cloth, metal, and spices. Merchant activity could overlap with diplomacy, religion, and artisan mobility, so a traveler on the road might carry messages, carry beliefs, or carry skills as readily as cargo. The same person could belong to commerce and to something wider than commerce, because caravan life relied on mixed forms of movement. Commercial cargo could travel alongside diplomatic, ritual, or religious movement, with those motives remaining distinct. Such overlap gave the exchange a social breadth that simple carting never would. A merchant who knew the local leg also knew people, obligations, and routes of contact. Networks of relationship made the handoff more than a mechanical transfer. They helped convert distance into continuity by tying one community to the next through repeated exchange. In that setting, packing was part of a larger human system, one that depended on trust, translation, and the ability to hand things on without losing the thread. The caravan world therefore rested not only on beasts, ropes, and bundles, but also on shared practices that made movement legible across many communities. That flexibility helps explain why so many forms of passage could meet on the road without collapsing into confusion. Trade did not sit apart from public purpose. It touched it, and sometimes carried it, along the same working corridor. The same route could shift practice across centuries and polities. A corridor that worked under one power could be organized differently under another, and a stretch that favored one form of exchange in one period might look very different in the next. Packing, handoff, and travel all answered to that change. No single itinerary captures the Silk Road's experience, because the road was never one frozen pattern waiting to be copied. It was a family of arrangements, each shaped by time, authority, and local habit. That is why any tidy summary feels too smooth. The route could be thick with movement in one era and reorganized in another, while the basic habit of sectional travel survived in altered form. Even the merchant's task could change as the political frame changed around it. A border, a dynasty, or a local custom could tighten the handoff, reroute a segment, or change who carried the burden of trust. Packing was never merely packing. It belonged to an economy that adjusted to shifting expectations and shifting rule. What remained constant was the need to keep goods moving through successive hands. What changed was the shape of the passage itself and the terms under which it remained possible. In that sense, the caravan road stayed historical in the fullest way, always being remade while it kept going. A familiar stretch might remain in use, yet the rules, contacts, and burdens attached to it could look different from one age to the next. The road remained the road, yet its workings never stood still. That variation kept the route flexible without making it uniform. Surviving fragments preserve local slices of movement, not universal routine. That matters because the Silk Roads are often imagined as if they followed a single script, while the surviving traces point instead to partial, situated activity. One site may show a particular kind of transfer, another a different arrangement, and neither by itself can stand for the whole. Together, those pieces suggest a landscape of repeated handoffs, practical packing, and commerce shaped by terrain, networks, and political change. The result is less a single story than a corridor of related stories, all connected yet none identical. The scale stays honest when each fragment keeps its own place. The caravan moved by steps, not by myth, and goods went forward through a world that was always larger than any one traveler's path. From these pieces, the road remains in motion while no single place claims the whole. That is enough to keep the picture clear. Each shard, cargo trace, or road mark shows how local practice worked, where people actually loaded, passed on, and carried forward. Taken together, they leave the caravan moving without pretending to freeze it. The route can be understood as a chain of ordinary decisions made at different points, under different circumstances, by different hands. Its unity lies in repetition, not in sameness. The next stretch inherits that pattern and adapts it again, because the road never belongs to one moment alone. In that quiet sense, the packing of animals and goods points beyond itself, toward a longer movement that keeps changing as it travels. The road simply keeps moving, carrying the same habit forward. Tang period art keeps returning to horses and riders, and those repeated scenes preserve Central Asian contact without making every road look alike. The animal figures do more than mark travel. They place people, mounts, and loads inside a wider pattern of exchange that reached across different climates, different surfaces, and different local habits. Camels appear as one important vehicle in that pattern, especially where bulk and distance mattered. Yet they do not replace the horse or define the whole system. Regional variation still shaped what moved and how it moved, so a route through one zone could favor one kind of load, while another zone favored a different balance. That is why the caravan world in this period should be understood as mixed traffic rather than a single procession. A horse could suggest movement and speed, a rider could signal human presence, and together they could carry a memory of contact as well as a trace of travel. The point is not sameness. It is a road network in which different animals answered different needs, and in which the same broad exchange could look distinct from one place to the next. Tang period artists preserved that variety by returning again and again to familiar forms while allowing each scene to keep its own local weight. The result is a caravan world that feels orderly enough to function and varied enough to remain shaped by place, purpose, and connection. That unevenness is exactly what keeps the caravan legible as history, rather than symbol alone, because it ties animal choice to distance, terrain, and the local habits that framed exchange closely. Camels point to one important vehicle in the caravan world, especially for long stretches where loads and endurance mattered, but they never turn the whole system into a camel-only story. Horses remain present in the same broad field of exchange, and the pairing matters because it shows how different animals could answer different pressures at once. Tomb figurines should not be read as a full caravan timetable, since they preserve a moment of representation rather than a complete schedule of departure, rest, and repacking. Surviving objects can still suggest movement without reconstructing every packing practice, and that is enough to show that goods were prepared for transport in flexible ways. Load choice could shift with distance, terrain, and the kind of road ahead, so packing animals were part of practical adjustment rather than one fixed formula. This makes the caravan scene easier to understand in general terms. A journey could combine different kinds of cargo and transport without a fixed allocation among animals or people. What matters is not a neat sequence, but a working arrangement. The animal, the cargo, and the route had to fit one another, and that fit could change from one region to the next. In that sense, camels mark an important branch of movement, while the wider packing system stayed adaptable, mixed, and grounded in what each stretch of travel required. That flexibility also explains why the same corridor could be used by different combinations of animal and cargo without losing its place in the larger exchange network. The scene stays practical, not ceremonial, and the practical purpose is what holds the arrangement together. Fragmentary texts and images speak more clearly about trade categories than about the exact choreography of packing each morning. They show what kinds of things moved, and they suggest how those things were grouped, named, and carried across distance. The broad picture is one of sorted goods rather than a fixed script of loading and unloading. Some cargo belonged to bulk movement, some to smaller exchange, and some to goods that crossed hands again after the first leg of travel. Those distinctions matter because they reveal a caravan economy organized around different kinds of value and different kinds of weight. A bale, a bundle, or a container could imply a different handling practice, but the surviving material does not pin those practices to one rigid routine. Instead, it points to a flexible system in which merchants and carriers adjusted to the kind of item in front of them. That is why the daily sequence should not be forced into a single model. The categories are clearer than the choreography, and that is enough to show how packing supported long-distance trade. The road depended on sorting, matching load to animal, and keeping different goods in motion without making every corridor behave the same way. From one place to the next, the order could change while the underlying habit of classification remained steady. That steadiness did not erase regional variation, because each corridor could favor a different mix of pack animal, load, and exchange partner, even when the same broad categories of goods were recognizable across the route. The result was a stable habit of sorting that still left room for local practice. The same image may represent exchange, status, or memory rather than routine travel, and that broadens the meaning of horse, rider, and camel scenes. A mounted figure can mark contact with Central Asian lands, but it can also carry rank, remembrance, or the kind of prestige attached to long-distance connection. Tang period art preserves that contact repeatedly, yet it does not flatten every setting into one voice. Regional variation still mattered, so the emphasis could shift from bulk carrying to speed, from human presence to social display, or from practical movement to remembered association. That flexibility helps explain why packing animals belonged to culture as well as trade. They were carriers of goods, but they were also recognizable forms through which distance became legible and socially meaningful. A viewer in one place might read a horse one way and a camel another way, while a different region could lean toward another arrangement or another emphasis. The objects and images therefore speak to more than transport. They show how exchange could be remembered, styled, and valued in forms that outlasted the journey itself. That does not make the caravan less practical. It shows that practical movement and social meaning traveled together, and that the same loaded animal could stand for commerce, contact, or memory without losing its place in the road. In this world, the packing of animals was never only about reaching the next stopping point. That layered meaning could connect practical transport with remembered social significance across different settings and regional traditions. Later comparisons can illuminate the road, but they must stay separate and never be collapsed into one ancient route. The caravan world across Eurasia was not a single lane with one animal, one load, and one pattern of meaning. It was a set of related corridors in which horses, camels, riders, and cargo could appear in different balances while still serving long-distance exchange. Tang period art keeps that complexity in view through horses, riders, and continued Central Asian contact, and camel imagery marks one important branch of transport without exhausting the whole system. Fragmentary texts and images keep the focus on trade categories, while the tomb figurines and other objects preserve movement without turning it into a fixed timetable or a complete packing manual. The same image can carry exchange, status, or memory, which is why no single reading should be pushed across every case. What survives, then, is not uniformity, but a workable balance between animal choice, cargo, route, and local practice. That balance gave the Silk Roads their durable shape in daily life. It also left room for differences that mattered from one region to the next, so the caravan remained adaptable rather than rigid. Different zones pressed different needs onto the same traveling world, so no single packing pattern could stand for the whole road. The result was a flexible order, one that let distance, terrain, and contact remain visible together as the caravan moved onward into the next stretch of road. That is the scale that matters here, because variety made the route workable without turning it into a single fixed pattern everywhere. Caravan travel brought together merchants and other participants through organized movement across connected routes. Artisans came with their tools and habits of work, diplomats with instructions, missionaries with purpose, mercenaries with pay in mind, and many others whose reasons for travel did not match one another. Some traveled by choice, some by obligation, and forced movement belonged in the same overland world. That variety did more than fill a road. It shaped the Silk Roads as a system for moving people with different motives across long distances. A caravan was therefore a practical alliance, not a single profession on the march. Its animals carried different cargo categories, while the people involved represented several social worlds along each connected route in practice. Goods, crafts, languages, and religions moved together through the same contact zones, and the route joined them before any city gate or market stall appeared. In that setting, multilingual contact was ordinary. People needed enough of one another's words to bargain, ask, answer, and keep a journey workable, even when no shared tongue was complete. No single caravan group can stand for every overland journey, because the road served wealth and dependence, ambition and compulsion, labor and rank. One convoy might be organized around trade, another around service, another around faith, another around force. The common thread was movement itself, repeated across the same broad transcontinental space. That is why the caravan should be understood as a moving mixture, assembled from motives that could differ sharply yet still share the same path. That mix made the road legible as commerce, service, and coercion together. At the points where routes converged, settlements tied to Sogdian merchants became anchors in Silk Road traffic. Their prominence shows how one influential trading community could shape movement without representing every caravan on the route. The pattern points to repeated local infrastructures rather than a road for a single people. Distant goods could be gathered and transferred at settlement stops without reconstructing exact rooms or handling routines. They also made room for travelers with different languages and motives to enter and leave the same stream of exchange. This was not a closed merchant world. The same network that favored one community also served others whose customs, religions, and purposes were different. A caravan needed such places because cargo that looked profitable in one city could become awkward on rough ground, and loads had to be balanced before the animals moved onward. The built environment of trade was therefore a chain of usable stops, not a single grand highway. It linked one working space to the next, and each space made the following stage possible. In that chain, goods and skills traveled together. A cloth bolt, a metal fitting, a written formula, or a method could pass through one stop and reappear elsewhere in a new setting. Languages moved too, because the life of the road relied on enough shared speech to keep transactions moving. Multilingual contact belonged to the route's ordinary social world, not an interruption to it. The same held wherever traders, servants, or travelers of different standing passed through a settlement, since the stop worked by letting them share ground long enough to continue. Markets and lodging stops brought the caravan's mixed company into direct contact. There, travelers crossed social boundaries because sellers, carriers, and newcomers had to deal with one another before trust or familiarity could matter. This did not erase rank or difference, but it created a working surface where they could matter less than the immediate needs of exchange. The Silk Roads supported that kind of mobility for people with different motives. Merchants sought profit, artisans looked for patrons or employment, diplomats carried instructions, missionaries moved with purpose, mercenaries searched for work, and others traveled under constraint. All of them entered the same broad system of movement, even when their freedom was sharply unequal. The route did not sort them into separate worlds. It linked destinations that would otherwise have remained far apart. and it linked the people who reached those places as well. Goods and people were not neatly separated either. A bolt of cloth, a metal vessel, a religious text, or a technical practice could move because someone had reason to carry it and someone else had reason to receive it. In that setting, a market or lodging stop was more than a place to pause. It was a place where social difference became workable for long enough to keep travel going. Language made that possible. Multilingual contact was part of the road's ordinary life, so a traveler often had to rely on more than one tongue in the same exchange. That flexibility allowed bargains and arrangements to continue across social and linguistic boundaries. That exchange could be cautious, uneven, and still effective. Overland travel was not a single category. Some journeys were commercial, some diplomatic, some religious, some military, and some enforced. That range changes the meaning of every load, because a bale of silk, a bundle of tools, a message, or a text of faith could travel beside people whose freedom differed sharply. Forced movement belongs in the story of the Silk Roads alongside choice, and the two often met in the same corridor. The caravan was therefore an instrument of mobility, but not always of equal mobility. It opened paths for people with money, rank, or purpose, while also serving systems that moved others under pressure. Even so, those unequal movements still joined a common world. Languages had to be used across difference, and religious ideas appeared where they were least expected, not because one community owned the road, but because the road connected many communities. The social logic of the journey was shaped by that connection. A person traveling under contract, command, devotion, or coercion still entered the ordinary life of the route, and the same animals, pack gear, and roads could carry benefit for one traveler and constraint for another in the hands of the people and institutions that used it most. That is why the Silk Roads resist neat labels. Their traffic was commercial and political, devotional and military, free and constrained, often within the same stretch of country. The load and the company changed from one stage to another, so any tidy picture of a caravan captures only part of the route's life. The road tied unequal journeys together without making them the same. Taken together, these journeys make the Silk Roads less a single road than a chain of repeated crossings. One influential trading community left a strong mark in places such as Sogdian settlements, but it never exhausted the picture. Merchants, artisans, diplomats, missionaries, mercenaries, and many others moved under the same broad umbrella, and some did so by choice, while others did not. Goods, crafts, languages, and religions passed through the same contact zones, so what rode on an animal was never only freight. Markets and lodging stops let strangers meet across boundaries, and multilingual exchange made those meetings workable. A caravan prepared in that way was practical first: balance the load, secure the cargo, and keep the route open. Yet the practical side carried social force as well. It linked people with different motives, different degrees of freedom, and different kinds of purpose into one moving system. Even the most ordinary bundle on the trail belonged to a larger circulation of ideas and identities. No single caravan group represents every overland journey, and no one road user defines the whole route. That is why the Silk Roads should be pictured as a living corridor of many kinds of travel rather than a fixed type of convoy. That broad pattern endured because the road made room for exchange without turning every traveler into the same kind of traveler. After the loads were set, the animals could move with the weight they had been given, and the world of the road advanced with that mixture already in place. Then the journey moved onward with that mixture already in place. By the time an overland company began to move, labor was already governing the day. Some merchants walked beside laden animals because the loads and the ground determined how far the group could advance. Across desert tracks, steppe roads, and mountain paths, the same journey could demand different efforts, and merchants had to adapt their movement to terrain and to the strain of carrying trade goods. Capacity mattered as much as distance. Camels, horses, mules, and donkeys could all appear in one traveling company, yet none of them removed the limits set by weight, slope, and rough footing. Overland movement was therefore a working passage rather than a graceful crossing. The road tied people and animals together in the same itinerary, and every mile had to answer to the amount that could be borne without breaking the pace. The caravan's daily rhythm began in that practical balance, with speed checked by the burden, the shape of the ground, and the need to keep the company moving in a usable line. What mattered first was not comfort, but a pace that the animals could sustain and the merchants could maintain. The journey was built from endurance, from watching the load, and from accepting that the road would never grant motion for free, because each stretch had to be earned by bodies, animals, and careful judgment together, step by step, along a course that kept narrowing the choices available to everyone in the line. That discipline kept commerce moving across distance without pretending the road was easy. Resupply and rest shaped the journey, so the caravan could not settle into one exact schedule. The road's pace depended on stopping points rather than fixed timetables, and those pauses mattered more than any neat division of morning, midday, or evening. A company carrying goods had to think about water, fodder, and the next place where people and animals might halt long enough to continue. Movement therefore rose and fell with practical need instead of a clock set apart from the road that made the route feel less like a straight line than a chain of obligations. One stretch could carry the group farther than another, while a shorter stretch could still prove harder than it looked. It did not advance by command. It was a sequence of decisions made under pressure from distance, supply, and strain. Each stop belonged to the travel itself, because the next stage depended on reaching a point that could support the company again. Travel days varied, so no universal caravan routine fits every journey. The steady pattern was adjustment, with each stage waiting on the animals, the cargo, and the ground that could bear the next advance. The day moved by pauses as much as by motion, and those pauses gave overland travel its practical rhythm. A caravan therefore carried no single timetable from place to place, only the habit of measuring movement against what the route would allow. That habit kept the company ready for another stretch as soon as the road made one possible. Merchants adapted movement to terrain and the strain of transporting loads, so progress shifted as the route shifted. A slope, a stony crossing, a softer track, or a place where footing narrowed could alter the pace in immediate ways. This was not a matter of dramatic turns, only of constant adjustment. The group had to watch what the animals could bear and how the path itself shaped forward motion. Overland travel belonged to hard routine rather than ease. A route that seemed plain in one glance became demanding once weight, animals, and ground were brought together. The caravan moved by respecting limits built into every step. A heavy load on a bad stretch did not ask for elegance, it asked for patience and a slower rhythm. Travel in that setting was less like crossing empty space than like negotiating a sequence of obstacles that could not be rushed. The pace belonged to the road as much as to the people on it. Every change in surface or incline mattered, because each change asked for a different use of strength, and strength was the one resource no caravan could waste. The same company might quicken on one segment and slow on the next, not by choice alone, but because terrain and burden kept resetting what movement could safely mean. Fatigue gathered as the miles changed shape, and a measured pace protected both cargo and animal power for whatever stretch came after the next rise or narrowing in the track along the route. Different animals brought different strengths, and that variety shaped the rhythm of the whole company. One caravan might lean on animals that carried heavier loads, while another relied more on animals suited to long distance or rough ground. The important point is not a single ideal beast, but the way transport capacity governed the shape of movement. A caravan had to think in terms of what could be carried, what had to remain light, and what could wait until a later stage. That restraint affected the pace of the road and the confidence with which people could set out. If a group overreached, the journey punished the choice. If it measured itself carefully, the road became more manageable, though never easy. In that sense, the animals were not merely cargo bearers, they were part of the calculation that made a route possible at all. Their differing capacities turned travel into a matter of proportion, where the right balance mattered more than any fantasy of speed. The day's rhythm came from matching burden to strength and from keeping the company within the limits the road would accept. The caravan gained movement by fitting cargo, animals, and distance together, not by pretending they were interchangeable. Even a mixed string of pack animals required judgment about weight and sequence, because the line moved only as quickly as its most strained element allowed, and no single animal type could erase the road's demands. That made every departure an exercise in measured, deliberate restraint. Walking travelers and pack animals shared the same laboring itinerary, and that fact gave the caravan its plain social structure. People on foot could not treat themselves as removed from the work of movement, because their steps helped carry the journey just as surely as the animals did. The caravan therefore took shape as a working community, where motion itself counted as effort for the entire company. Overland movement was labor, not leisurely passage, and that truth shaped how everyone understood the day. A merchant on foot, a handler beside the loads, and the animals under strain all belonged to the same working rhythm. Nothing in that arrangement invited ease for its own sake. The road asked for attention, endurance, and a willingness to keep pace with whatever the terrain allowed. That shared burden created a sober kind of order, one in which the journey moved only as long as people and animals could keep up. The daily pattern was practical before it was anything else, built from work that had to be carried forward step by step. Travel days varied, so no universal caravan routine describes every journey, and the same road could feel different whenever the balance of load, ground, and support changed from one stretch to the next for people and animals alike. The company moved as a working line, bound by the same effort and the same limits. Hierarchy mattered, but the shared burden made the caravan legible first as a unit of labor, not ease. Seen together, these patterns keep the caravan from turning into a fixed schedule. The day might begin in motion and end in motion, but the middle was shaped by whatever the route and the load required. One stretch could demand more walking, another could allow a slightly easier tempo, yet none of that produced a single universal routine that could describe every caravan everywhere. That is the plain historical shape of the journey, variable, practical, and responsive to terrain, animals, and support points along the road. If the pace seems slow, it is because the work was real. If it seems uneven, it is because the road itself set the terms. The caravan's daily life was built from that negotiation, from carrying enough to matter and not so much as to break the movement, from matching strength to slope, and from treating each stop as part of the path rather than as a pause from it. That rhythm carried the company forward until the next opening in the road, where the work of motion would begin again. The road kept setting the terms, and the caravan kept answering them with patience and adjustment as the company pressed on. Because stopping points governed what came next, each advance remained provisional, tied to the conditions that made the following miles possible and to the practical discipline that held the whole line together. No single rule rode along with the caravan. The company moved by adjusting to the next usable halt in turn. Silk Road's travel did not move across an empty line on a map. It moved through corridor landscapes where distance, water, and access had to be managed together, Way stations and watchtowers organized that passage, turning a hard stretch of road into something legible enough for traffic to continue. They marked where a traveler could pause, where authority could be present, and where the route itself narrowed into a sequence of controlled steps. Settlement, surveillance, and transit infrastructure worked together here, not as separate ideas, but as parts of one system. A caravan entering that world was not simply crossing wilderness, it was entering a network of places that knew how to receive movement, watch it, and send it onward. Those connected portions of the route network linked deserts, river corridors, and fertile edges without making them feel the same. Each section kept its own habits, but the passage between them was steady enough to support regular travel. That was the daily rhythm at the heart of long-distance commerce: advance, check-in, resupply, and move again, with the landscape itself shaping the pace. When you picture the road this way, it becomes less a single journey than a chain of managed transitions, and that rhythm is what gave the caravan its working order. Between those points, movement depended on the same practical cadence everywhere: fit the route to animals, water, and load, then keep the line of travel open without flattening the local character of the places it crossed. One reason caravan travel could function was that access was never assumed. Guarded entry points show that movement could be monitored, and that monitoring mattered most where traffic passed from one controlled stretch into another. A traveler did not simply drift through, passage had to fit the order of the route. Shelter points were practical responses to terrain, not decorative stopovers, because the road itself often offered little comfort beyond the chance to remain inside a usable system. Their value lay in what they made possible: a pause that kept the larger movement going. Water systems mattered for the same reason. Travelers, beasts, and cargo all needed resupply, and without that shared requirement, the rest of the arrangement would have broken down. In dry or exposed country, even a short stop had to solve several problems at once. It had to give people a place to manage loads, care for animals, and take on what was needed for the next stretch. That is why the built features of the route are so important. They were not symbols laid over the landscape, they were working answers to the demands of distance. The caravan's daily rhythm was therefore not a free flow across open space. It was a sequence of controlled openings, each one narrow enough to supervise and practical enough to keep commerce alive. A route that could be watched, sheltered, and watered could also be used again tomorrow. It made the next day predictable without making the road easy. The corridor landscape did something subtle and important. It supported transit without erasing regional differences. That is what made the Silk Roads more than a single strip of infrastructure. A traveler could move through a connected system and still pass from one social and ecological setting to another, each with its own resources, routines, and constraints. The built landscape helped make that transition workable. Roads, stations, and checkpoints did not turn the whole route into one uniform place. Instead, they stitched together parts of the route network that remained distinct even while they served a shared flow of movement. For caravan trade, that meant daily life had to stay flexible. A team could not rely on one pattern everywhere, because the corridor did not offer one pattern everywhere. The support structure made passage possible, but it also preserved local variety in the way goods were handled, in the kind of resupply available, and in the rhythm that each stretch of route imposed. That combination matters. Long-distance movement was never just about distance covered. It was about learning how to keep going while the world around you changed from one segment to the next. The result was a practical kind of continuity. People, animals, and cargo could remain in motion precisely because the route accepted difference instead of flattening it. In that sense, the caravan was not escaping the landscape. It was working with a corridor that balanced connection and variety at the same time throughout the same broad journey. Dunhuang points to a local form of travel control that fits the broader pattern of the corridor. Here, Movement was not left to chance. It was handled through rules that made passage legible to the people who watched it and to the people who used it. That kind of control tells you something important about caravan life. A route was not merely a physical path from one place to another. It was a social space where transit had to be recognized, managed, and sometimes limited. In a place like this, the daily rhythm of the caravan included more than packing and walking. It also included fitting oneself into an ordered system of arrival, access, and departure. That order did not need to erase the journey's variety to work. It simply made the flow of people and goods compatible with local authority. When surveillance and settlement met the road, travel became part of the life of the place rather than an interruption to it. The result was a corridor that could absorb movement while still keeping it visible. That is one reason long-distance exchange could persist across wide distances. The route network was not an abstract line floating over the map. It was made real in towns and stations where local control shaped what passage looked like, and where the presence of travelers became one more element in the organized life of the road. It also made strangers' movement a normal, supervised part of daily urban order for that town. Settlement, surveillance, and transit infrastructure did more than keep traffic moving. Together, they connected portions of the route network into a system that people could recognize and use. That connection mattered because the road was not one continuous social world. It was a chain of places with different obligations and capacities, and the infrastructure made the chain usable. A caravan moving through it relied on that structure to know where movement could be received, where it could be observed, and where it could be handed on. The social consequence was a corridor of contact rather than a blank passage. Merchants, guards, port officials, local residents, and transport workers all existed within the same ordered flow, each with a different relation to the movement passing through. The presence of settlement meant that the road was never far from human oversight. The presence of surveillance meant that passage remained visible. The presence of transit infrastructure meant that visibility did not stop movement, it gave movement a form. That is a useful way to think about caravan daily life. The rhythm was not simply physical exertion, it was also a repeated adjustment to nodes, permissions, and practical arrangements that linked one place to the next. In that sense, the road made communities part of the journey even when they were not the destination. It bound movement to places that could manage it, and it gave long-distance exchange a stable social frame without making every stop identical across the moving corridor of travel. Once you put those pieces together, the Silk Roads look less like a dramatic line of caravans and more like a durable habit of movement. Interconnected routes crossed varied regions and communities, and they did so by making passage possible without making the whole corridor identical. That is the larger pattern behind daily life on the road. A traveler could move from one zone of rule to another, from one settlement pattern to another, and from one set of practical arrangements to another, while still staying inside a recognizable network. The connections were strong enough to carry trade, but they were also selective enough to keep local difference in view. That balance helps explain why the caravan's rhythm mattered so much. Each day on the road depended on a sequence of openings, checks, and handoffs that linked people to places and places to one another. The journey was ordinary in that sense. Even when the distances were vast, it relied on infrastructure, supervision, and resupply, not on spectacle. It also relied on the fact that the route joined communities that remained themselves while taking part in wider movement. That is the quiet achievement of the corridor world. It let traffic pass through a landscape of difference and still preserve the connections that made travel worth the trouble. When the caravan kept moving, it was following a system built to carry many worlds at once. That is why passage could feel controlled, uneven, and continuous at once for everyone involved. At Dunhuang, some manuscripts recorded travel days and distances in specific contexts. and that detail gives the caravan road a measured shape. Movement appears beside the ordinary business of the center, so passage was not only a matter of camels, riders, and open ground, it also belonged to writing, where a day on the road or a stretch of distance could be entered into the same world that handled accounts and orders. That made travel accountable. It could be stated, compared, and later checked, which is a quieter picture than the easy habit of imagining the Silk Roads as a blur of motion. The road still covered real distance, but the rhythm of that distance could be noted and organized in practical terms. In that setting, a journey did not begin as a grand panorama. It began as something that could be written down. Once movement entered the page, it joined the daily work of offices and clerks, and the road took on a steadier pace. The caravan world here looks less like a single dramatic crossing than a sequence of counted stages, each one placed within a known order. That first written rhythm matters because it turns travel into a manageable part of local life, and it sets the tone for everything that follows. The setting remains local, and the rhythm stays grounded in ordinary administration rather than sweeping road legend. Payment sits beside movement in those same papers. Some fragments note wages, while others note payment in commodities, and together they show that labor on the road could be settled in more than one form. Local documents preserve wages and commodity payment without identifying a complete daily labor reckoning. They show that compensation could include goods as well as money within a bounded local context. That kind of entry turns movement into administration. Work, transport, and exchange are all folded into the same practical language, so the caravan's rhythm is not only about distance covered, but about obligations being met. At this trade religious administrative center, passage was watched, and the paperwork reflects that guarded setting. The local archive preserves how people and goods were managed there, not the entire caravan world, yet that narrow frame is useful. It shows travel moving through offices, through notes of payment, and through lists that made the exchange visible. In that environment, a caravan did not drift free of authority. It moved within an order that expected accounting as part of the journey itself. The road, therefore, had a financial pulse as well as a physical one. Nothing here needs coin alone to explain the everyday settling of work. When wages and commodity payments appear together, they show that the daily rhythm included settling what was owed before the next stretch could unfold. Movement and settlement were not separate steps. They belonged to the same practical system, and that system made the caravan legible to the people responsible for it. Written scraps do a different kind of work from painted scenes. They do not freeze a caravan in a single emblematic pose, but they can pin down routines that images cannot time precisely. A note that marks a travel day, or that separates one stretch of movement from another, gives repetition a shape. It lets the daily rhythm appear as a sequence of handled tasks, rather than as a single blurred crossing. Within that sequence, labor is carried, payments are entered, and movement is registered in ways that make ordinary days visible. This is not a universal timetable, and it should not be pressed into one. It belongs to the local administrative world that produced it. Still, the effect is clear. Travel can be followed as a habit of accounting, not just as a change of place. That is why the written trace matters here. It places the caravan's pace into a dependable order without turning it into legend. The routine is quieter than later stories often make it sound. It rests on handover, obligation, and checked passage, all of them ordinary enough to enter the archive. In that way, the documents give shape to a rhythm that might otherwise dissolve into general memory, and they keep the caravan tied to the practical workings of the center that handled it. Dunhuang's documents keep the rhythm close to the offices that handled it, where passage remained part of ordinary work and the local frame stays attached to that administrative center. The same local setting also shows how guarded that movement could be. Dunhuang was a trade, religious, and administrative center, and its documents preserve passage through that layered world. Travel there did not vanish into a blank frontier, it passed under watch. Local documents reveal movement being monitored, written down, and managed, which gives the caravan a sharper social outline. A traveler was moving through a place where local administration guarded movement without revealing a complete procedure for arrivals, departures, or carried goods. That supervision did more than restrain movement. It made movement legible. Once passage could be entered in writing, the road joined office work, and office work reached back toward the road. The result was a daily rhythm shaped by checks as well as by miles. Inside that sphere, the caravan's progress depended on recognized procedures, not on a free-floating idea of travel. The center did not govern every road in the same way, and it did not impose a universal schedule across the Silk Roads. Even so, the local archive makes one thing plain. Movement could be measured against authority, and the act of moving could become part of the center's ordinary business. That is a different social world from the open road picture, more contained and more managed, but still rooted in the practical demands of trade and passage. Accounting and supervision sat together, and the same discipline that sorted goods also sorted movement. The center's ordinary business reached into the road and made passage answerable. Because the documents can name travel days, distances, wages, and commodity payments, travel itself becomes something that can be accounted for. That small shift matters. A journey that can be listed can also be checked and compared, and it can be folded into office work without losing its connection to the road. The caravan's rhythm is therefore not separate from administration, it runs through it. Departure, distance, obligation, and transfer all enter the same written frame, and the daily pace is understood through that frame rather than outside it. The world that appears here is orderly without being fixed. It works without a single universal timetable for every caravan, because the local system already keeps movement answerable in its own way. The documents show a working pattern in which the road is managed through notes, offices, and routine accounting, while still remaining a road. That balance gives the travel its steady character. Nothing in these scraps suggests a world of drift. They suggest a world in which movement was expected to leave a trace in writing, and where the trace helped hold commerce and passage together. In that sense, the caravan's daily rhythm was part of the broader life of the center, not an exception to it. The road belonged to the same order that handled payments, lists, and controlled movement, and that order made repeated travel possible. That is why the routine feels stable without becoming rigid, and why the same entries can hold both movement and obligation. Taken together, these fragments make the caravan's daily rhythm feel practical rather than legendary. Travel days and distances, wages and commodity payments, and the careful noting of passage all point to a life that could be written into place, that does not make the Silk Roads neat or uniform, and it does not turn every journey into the same experience. It does show that movement could be organized, supervised, and remembered in the language of routine. In the center at Dunhuang, the road entered a world of offices and documents that kept departure, distance, obligation, and transfer in view. The result is a steady pattern, one that feels measured rather than hurried. It has no need for spectacle. It depends instead on the ordinary act of turning travel into something that could be checked later, then carried forward into the next stage. From this side of the road, the rhythm continues without drama. The path remains linked to the place that handled it, and the place remains tied to the habits of accounting that gave the movement its order. That quiet structure is enough to carry the caravan onward, with the next stretch waiting beyond the written notes. Its calm order is enough to carry the caravan forward, because the road depends on repeated checks more than on drama. What remains is a pattern of measured movement held together by writing, authority, and the habit of accounting at one center, where passage remained visible in the language of routine. On the Silk Roads, the road was never a single kind of passage. Trade sent people east and west, but diplomacy did as well, and pilgrimage too, and the quieter traffic of cultural exchange kept the same corridors in motion. You could meet a caravan not only because somebody hoped to sell something, but because another party wanted an audience, a blessing, a message, or a place in a larger world. That variety mattered because it gave the route a pulse broader than cargo counts. It tied markets to courts, shrines to towns, and far-off communities to one another through repeated movement. The same tracks carried merchants, envoys, worshippers, and people who simply had reasons to go where they were needed. A road used by so many aims became less like a line on a map and more like a working social space where purpose was shared even when profit was not. In practice, that meant a caravan could be read by the kinds of commitments moving with it, not just by the goods on its backs. Once you see that, the caravan is easier to understand as part of an entire mobile society, not a procession of pack animals alone. The road connected ends that were political, devotional, and personal at the same time. It was a corridor of movement before it was ever a story about merchandise. It also reminds you that movement itself could be the common language of distant societies, even when their goals remained separate. Not every traveler was a merchant, and not every merchant set out for profit alone. Some traveled because they served communities that reached beyond one town or one kingdom. Missionaries moved along the same overland network as diplomats, and skilled migrants did too, carrying knowledge rather than bales of cloth. In that world, a journey could be part of service, persuasion, resettlement, or learning, and the line between business and obligation was often thin. A person might be traveling for patronage, for office, for teaching, or for the chance to place work and reputation in a wider field. Others moved under the protection of rulers, temples, or trading houses that valued their presence for reasons larger than a single sale. That is one reason the route never belonged to commerce by itself. It was shared by people whose aims overlapped only partly and whose reasons changed the meaning of the road. If you imagine the corridor as a single commercial machine, you miss how often it also moved messages, expertise, and claims to legitimacy. Those quieter kinds of movement helped knit distant regions together without turning every traveler into a seller. They also made the road a place where status and service could travel alongside profit. Some traveled under letters of recommendation, others under religious obligation, and others because their craft was wanted elsewhere, so the road carried service, credibility, and practical need together. That mix gave overland travel a standing in public life that pure commerce never fully explained. Religious travel formed one motive within Silk Road's mobility, and it stood beside the others rather than above them. People set out toward sacred places, toward teachers, toward communities of devotion, and toward obligations that crossed political frontiers. The journey itself could matter because it linked a believer to a wider tradition and to companions who understood the same disciplines. Yet that sacred movement did not cancel ordinary travel. A pilgrim could share the road with a trader, an envoy, or a skilled artisan, each carrying a different purpose through the same difficult geography. The point is not that everyone believed the same things, but that the overland network made room for varied religious lives. Some travelers were moving to fulfill vows, some to visit revered places, and some to join communities whose authority was recognized far from home. Others could be passing through markets or border towns on the way to religious centers, which reminds you that devotion and logistics were never entirely separate. That variety gave the corridor a layered character. It was practical and devout, commercial and ceremonial, all at once. On the road, those intentions passed one another and shaped the daily rhythm of movement just as surely as baggage and beasts did. Pilgrimage was one current in a broader stream, not the whole river. In that sense, a vow could shape the same route that a ledger used without becoming the same thing. The corridor held both, and neither cancelled the other at all. Markets and cities drew travelers whose purposes exceeded commerce. A busy urban place offered more than a stall or a price. It offered news, contacts, patronage, instruction, repair, and the chance to attach oneself to a larger flow of people and goods. That is why a road led not only to buying and selling, but to meeting, waiting, consulting, and arranging the next step. The market square and the city gate could become gathering points for travelers who had no intention of becoming permanent residents. They came because urban life concentrated opportunity and because a caravan needed those concentrations as much as it needed open road. A city could be a place where a message changed hands, a credential was recognized, or a skill found a new setting. It could also be the point where a traveler discovered a patron, a client, or a companion for part of the onward route. This is one reason Silk Road's movement cannot be reduced to exchange of merchandise. Urban centers pulled in persons with mixed reasons, and those reasons often stayed mixed. Commerce remained central, but it was only one thread in a thicker cord of movement, connection, and use. The city made that mixture visible, then sent it back out again. That mix mattered because urban crowds could make temporary communities out of strangers who shared only part of the journey. A city was therefore a magnet for movement as much as a marketplace was, for a time, there as well. In the same corridor, different motives mixed without collapsing into one type. A merchant, an envoy, a pilgrim, and a migrant could all travel under the same broad conditions, yet each carried a different place in the world. The road did not erase those differences, it made them visible by bringing them into contact. Someone might be bound by duty, another by faith, another by strategy, another by the hope of a better position. Those motives could overlap, but they did not become identical simply because the road was shared. A person moving with one purpose could still learn from the rhythm of another, and a convoy could hold several intentions at once without becoming confused about what each traveler wanted. That is why travel formed a social world, not only an economic one. People moved through relations of trust, rank, protection, and reputation as much as through transactions. They depended on introductions, on shared languages, on recognized customs, and on the practical habit of dealing with strangers. The caravan corridor was therefore more than transport. It was a moving society with its own rhythms of cooperation and sorting, and its own way of making distant people legible to one another. Commerce sat inside that society, but it did not explain it by itself. The road worked because many kinds of purpose could pass through it together. That is why the road never flattened identity, even while it encouraged practical cooperation among strangers who remained recognizably different all along. By the time the day advanced, that mixed company had already given the road its character. The same stretches of travel held exchange, devotion, office, and skill together, and the pattern repeated from one distance to the next. You can think of it, if you like, as a corridor of movement whose purpose was wider than trade alone, though any modern comparison should stay modest because the centuries and regions are not the same. What matters is the social shape of the journey. People came onto the route for different ends, met one another in transit, and left with their purposes still distinct. Some remained linked by obligation, some by belief, some by convenience, and some by the simple fact that the road kept placing them side by side. That is how the Silk Roads worked as a human landscape. Their daily rhythm came from variety, not uniformity, and from the fact that road life connected strangers without turning them into one kind of traveler. When the caravan moved on, it carried that variety with it, and the next stretch of the journey unfolded under the weight of many separate reasons for being there. The road did not end the differences, it organized them into movement. That variety gave the Silk Roads a daily rhythm that was social before it was commercial, and that rhythm carried people forward without dissolving their separate purposes. It is the clearest way to think about the route at this point in the journey. On a Silk Road's journey, a caravanserai was the kind of stop that made the road possible at all. It offered shelter for travelers, animals, and cargo, so the caravan did not have to face every stretch exposed to the open country. That mattered because crossing the road was not only a matter of endurance, it was also a matter of preserving the people, the beasts, and the loads that made the journey worthwhile. A roadside lodging reduced the strain of traveling across exposed terrain, giving a moving group a place where the day's pressure could ease without breaking the rhythm of the route. You can picture the place not as a grand retreat, but as a practical halt arranged for the necessities of movement. Its value lay in keeping a caravan intact enough to continue. In that sense, the caravanserai belonged to travel itself. It was part of the road's working design, a sheltering pause that helped costly movement remain possible over long distances. The stop answered the plain demands of distance, rest, protection, and a little order before the road opened again. Such places supported travelers and cargo, while their layouts varied too widely for a single reconstructed compound. What mattered was not comfort in the later sense, but the way the stop let travel continue with less waste of strength and less risk to the load. It was a pause measured in mileage saved, not luxury or delay. Inside such a stop, food and water mattered more than ornament. They turned the place into a practical halt, not a luxury inn, because the purpose was to restore the travelers and the animals enough for the next stretch of road. The caravanserai served as a place where movement was maintained, not merely interrupted. That distinction is easy to miss if you think only of beds and walls, yet it shaped the whole logic of the building. A shelter site answered the needs of fatigue, thirst, and wear, all while keeping cargo in the same system of care. The stop was therefore tied to maintenance as much as to rest. Travelers could pause there, but so could the loads and the beasts that carried them, and that combination made the place more than a roof over sleeping bodies. It was a point where the road's problems were managed in a simpler, steadier way. In a long overland journey, the difference between continuing and failing could be as ordinary as a secure place to draw water or share a basic meal. A caravanserai existed for that ordinary survival, which is why it belonged to the economy of distance as much as to the experience of stopping. They supported shelter, food, water, rest, and cargo needs within the wider work of overland travel and hospitality. The design turned a pause into a form of upkeep, keeping the journey's machinery in one place long enough to hold. That practical design made the compound work like part of the transport system. The courtyards, walls, and service spaces did more than receive guests. They gave the caravan a controlled place to sort itself after the road. Rest stops supported travelers, animals, and cargo together, and that shared support is why the stop belonged to logistics as much as to comfort. A caravan arriving there was not simply seeking sleep, it was looking for a safer arrangement of weight, breath, and time. In an overland chain of exchange, this kind of pause protected the wider movement of goods by keeping animals from being pressed past their limit and keeping loads from being handled in a rush on the road itself. The compound, therefore, acted as a working extension of the route. It gathered the necessities of travel into one enclosed space where movement could slow without coming apart. That is a plain but important feature of Silk Road's life. The road was not only a line between places, it depended on stations that could hold the journey together long enough for it to continue. Without such a stop, the caravan would have carried all of its strain outward into the next stage. With it, the strain was partially contained, and the road remained usable for the next day's progress. This was also why such places belonged to wider exchange networks, not just to one party on the road. They linked distant markets, local suppliers, and the steady circulation of animals, people, and goods across regions. Because Caravan's rise belonged to wider exchange networks, they brought different kinds of traffic into one shared system. Merchants, carriers, and animals moved through places that were never isolated from the markets and roads beyond them. That gave the building a social role as well as a practical one. It became a point where strangers in transit depended on the same arrangements for water, shelter, and order, and that dependence linked them to a larger world of overland exchange. The caravanserai was not a decorative pause on the map, it was a working node in overland logistics, where movement paused and prepared to continue. In that sense, the stop helped define the Silk Roads not as a single road, but as a mesh of routes sustained by reliable places to rest. A place like this could sit beside the road and still be fully part of the exchange system, because goods did not move only by motion, they moved by being protected, repositioned, and passed onward. Its significance came from the way it made far-traveled exchange ordinary, giving long-distance movement a dependable address along the route. That made the stop part of daily commerce at a scale larger than any one caravan, yet grounded in the most practical needs of travel. The broader world of exchange, therefore, rested on places that looked modest but kept motion reliable. In them, hospitality and transport were woven together, and the road gained a working rhythm that could survive distance after distance. That same practicality also shaped how people understood the stop. Because it was built for cargo as much as for hospitality, the caravanserai turned the simple act of resting into an organized pause in the business of exchange. Loads could be held together, animals could be spared further strain, and the journey could be checked against the limits of distance before it moved on. The result was not luxury, but order. In a world of overland trade, order mattered because the road had to absorb many kinds of pressure without collapsing into confusion. A place like this gave travelers a shared framework for continuing, even when they arrived with different origins, goods, or purposes. It made the movement of commerce less fragile by giving it a known station where the next step could begin from steadier ground. That is one reason such lodgings sat at the meeting point of hospitality and transport. It welcomed bodies, but it also kept the work of movement intact. A caravanserai was valuable because it treated rest as part of the journey's labor, not as a break from it. The stop turned pause into preparation, which is exactly what long-distance travel required if it was to remain regular, reliable, and worth the effort. Seen this way, the caravanserai did not simply interrupt the road. It stitched the road together, keeping animals, cargo, and travelers within a shared pattern of care that made the next stage possible without waste, delay, or unnecessary strain for all involved. After a halt like that, the caravan did not leave as if nothing had happened. It resumed with the benefit of protection, water, and a little order restored to people, animals, and cargo. The stop had done its quiet work, and that work mattered because overland travel depended on repeated recoveries, not on one heroic push across the map. A caravanserai gave the road a pulse of renewal. It linked movement to maintenance and maintenance to movement again, so that travel remained possible across long distances without exhausting everything at once. That is the plain importance of these roadside compounds. They kept the system of exchange from fraying where the terrain was hard and the distance was long. They also made the night legible as part of the journey's labor, not as a pause outside it. By the time the caravan was ready to move again, the stop had already done what it was built to do: shelter the travelers, hold the animals, steady the cargo, and send the whole enterprise back onto the road with less strain than it had brought in. In that way, the caravanserai belonged to the road's future as much as to its present, because each successful halt preserved the chance to continue. What began as shelter therefore ended as readiness, a small but essential reset that let the caravan keep pace with distance itself. The road had not paused outside the world, It had simply found a place to keep going once more. A caravanserai was never a single fixed design repeating across the Silk Roads. It belonged to a family of shelters, each one shaped by climate, available materials, and the period in which it was built. In one region, thick walls answered heat or cold. In another, timber, stone, or mud brick set the form. Across a long chronology, the same name could point to buildings that shared a purpose but not a look. That is why a Persian example cannot stand in for every roadside shelter, and why any one reconstruction stays only one moment in a much longer story. If you are following the road from one stopping place to the next, it helps to picture variety first, not uniformity. The shelter met travelers where they were, not where a later system might prefer them to be. Its plan came out of local conditions, and local conditions rarely stayed still for long. The result was practical, regional, and distinct, with each resting place answering a different stretch of road and a different season of use. A caravanserai, then, was less a template than a response, revised again and again as trade corridors shifted and building habits changed across centuries. Because the road passed through deserts, uplands, and river corridors, a shelter that suited one stretch could be awkward on another. Builders answered that by working from what they had, not from a distant ideal. Over time, the same practical name gathered many regional versions under it, but variability mattered at every stop. Those differences showed up in the body of the building itself. Built form responded to local resources rather than to one empire-wide template, so the same function could take many shapes. Caravanserai construction varied according to climate, available materials, and historical period. No single wall, roof, courtyard, or enclosure form can stand for every region, because local building traditions produced different architectural solutions along different routes. A hot route asked for shade and mass. A colder one needed enclosed protection and less exposure. None of this made the caravanserai less of a caravanserai. It made the shelter legible to its own landscape. Once you notice that, the building stops looking like a neutral container and starts looking like a practical answer to road conditions. It was architecture tuned to supply, weather, and labor, so the structure itself became part of the journey's logistics, not a decorative pause beside them. That is why the materials matter. They fixed what could be built, how long it lasted, and how much work the road demanded before the next departure. The same plan could feel heavy in one place and light in another, or durable in one century and improvised in the next. The materials did not merely decorate the building, they set its limits and its strengths. A builder worked with climate and supply first, then with memory and habit, so the wall line always began as a local decision and ended as a local accommodation. That practical tuning mattered most when animals, people, and goods had to be gathered under one roof of shared safety. A caravanserai needed to hold the working parts of movement without pretending that every route or season asked for the same arrangement. The architecture could not be reduced to a single universal model, because one model would flatten centuries of regional variation. In some places, heavier walls and enclosed courts served the climate. In others, lighter materials and more open layouts fit the available resources. Either way, the shelter helped turn the road into a sequence of manageable stages. Travelers could stop, protect what they carried, and let the pace of movement slow without breaking the larger order of exchange. That pause was not empty time. It was part of the system that kept long-distance travel possible. The building absorbed the strain of travel by giving it a temporary shape, and that shape changed as the road crossed different environments, different building traditions, and different political moments along the way. The practical effect was simple enough. A caravan could remain organized while resting, and the route could keep functioning afterward. The result was not just shelter. It was a small managed pause in a longer commercial rhythm, one that let routes stay viable across difficult ground. Rest worked because the place already knew how to contain disruption. That is what made the shelter useful to a long route. It converted interruption into order without pretending the road had stopped. The same variety appeared in the way these shelters organized their interiors and their edges. Some focused on a broad court, others on tighter arrangements of rooms and passages, but the point was always to answer the local balance of traffic, climate, and material supply. Regional shelter traditions stayed distinct from later medieval comparisons because a familiar label can hide how much time separates one form from another. A roadside shelter built in one century did not simply copy the next one, even when both served similar needs. As roads shifted and states changed, builders kept reworking the same basic idea in new conditions. That long sequence matters. It means a caravanserai should be read as a historical type with many variants, not as a timeless pattern. Once the traveler stepped inside, the architecture did more than protect from weather. It ordered the movement of bodies, baggage, and animals into a temporary settlement shaped for rest, storage, and onward departure. The design was never abstract. It was a local solution that kept being revised as trade routes and building practices evolved. The court, the passage, and the enclosure each served a practical role within that larger arrangement, and their balance shifted from place to place. For travelers, that meant the interior was organized enough to make pause productive, but not so rigid that the shelter lost its flexibility. Each variant still answered the road before it answered any grand architectural idea. The result was a building that could change in scale while keeping purpose steady. Because of that, a caravanserai also worked as a meeting point between different habits of travel. People arriving from separate directions could occupy the same shelter without sharing a single way of living. The structure made room for that diversity by staying flexible at the level of form. Climate and available materials shaped caravanserai architecture, but so did the practical need to make strangers coexist for a brief interval on the road. That is why no universal caravanserai model can do justice to the whole Silk Road's world. The shelter had to answer the conditions around it first, and only then could it serve the wider traffic of exchange. Persian examples belong within that larger pattern, not above it. They are one region's answer to a broader problem, not the standard for all roadside shelters. Seen that way, the building becomes less a monument than a working adaptation, quietly adjusted to the demands of route, season, and supply. Its purpose was durable, yet its form remained responsive, which is exactly what long-distance travel required. Different languages, customs, and loads could pass through the same threshold without needing to become the same people, and that practical coexistence was part of the road's ordinary order. That variety mattered socially as well as structurally. A shelter with a flexible plan could keep separate routines close without forcing them into sameness, and that made the building useful to the many communities that moved along the same routes. That practical balance made the stop durable across routes. So the stop itself carries the traveler forward by slowing the pace rather than ending it. A caravanserai marks a pause in motion, but the pause sits inside a longer chain of movement that stretches across climates and generations. The architecture changed with climate, materials, and historical period, and that changing form is part of the story of the road. One shelter could hold fewer bodies, another could hold more, and both could still belong to the same broad tradition of wayfaring rest. The important thing is to keep the variations visible. A single image of a roadside inn would flatten centuries of regional practice, while the real history is broader and more uneven. Each building answered local conditions in its own time, using what the place offered and what the journey required. From that angle, the caravanserai is not a fixed backdrop. It is the road's temporary architecture, built to absorb arrival, keep order, and release travelers back into motion when the route calls again. What follows is not a different world, only the next movement in the same one, with the road carrying its goods, habits, and expectations onward through a new landscape. That is the larger pattern to keep in view. Rest did not cancel movement, and variation did not weaken the system. It was precisely because the architecture changed with place and time that travelers could keep moving. Read that continuity as the road's quiet architecture, steady in function, varied in form, and tied to the places that kept it alive. When a caravan reached a city on the Silk Roads, the journey changed character without ending. The road moved into streets, courtyards, and gates, and the hard rhythm of distance gave way to a practical pause. Cities along the Silk Roads let travelers rest animals and resupply, and that service was part of the route itself. Pack animals needed relief after long stretches on open ground, and merchants needed grain, fodder, water, cord, repairs, and other basics before continuing. Urban hubs punctuated difficult overland journeys with that kind of interruption, and the interruption was useful rather than idle. The city did not stand apart from exchange, it became one of exchange's working rooms. A caravan stop in town turned transit into maintenance, and maintenance into the condition for further movement. The route therefore passed through inhabited space, not as a detour from commerce, but as one of its ordinary forms. That is why the first sight of walls, gates, and busy streets mattered so much in the wider pattern of travel. Settlement answered travel with structure, and structure made the next stage possible. In that setting, resting animals and replenishing supplies were not peripheral tasks. They were part of the same practical order that carried goods across regions. The city held the road in a managed interval, then released it again toward the open country beyond. A city stop could therefore feel less like a break than a working interval in which motion, rest, and supply stayed joined together. Inside that interval, the caravanserai gave the pause a usable form. Cities supported both rest and commerce for travelers, and the building gathered both purposes into one setting. A traveler could bring animals off the road and into a place built to absorb movement without stopping trade altogether. Resupply followed the same logic. Grain, fodder, water, tools, cord, and other ordinary provisions kept the next stretch of travel possible, because caravan movement depended on a chain of needs rather than on a single arrival. The caravanserai made that chain visible in built space. It was not a retreat from the route, but a piece of the route's own support system. The overland journey could continue only because the city made a reliable interval available for rest and provision. Such intervals were not luxuries. They were the difference between a road that could be sustained and one that could only be attempted once. A place set aside for travelers therefore served the same larger purpose as the road itself. It kept exchange moving by slowing it at the right moment. Rest was not separate from commerce. It was one of commerce's necessary conditions, and the urban stopping place gave that condition a stable form. The city framed the pause, and the pause protected the journey that still lay ahead. Within that order, the building also limited uncertainty, because a known place for pause helped organize the longer reach of travel and gave merchants a point for arranging what came next. That same city stop also drew buying, selling, and provisioning into the middle of transit. A city stop could turn transit into buying, selling, and provisioning because long-distance exchange met nearby local trade in the urban market. Merchants arriving with goods from farther away entered a setting where local sellers, provisioners, and other travelers were already active. Urban markets linked long-distance exchange with nearby local trade, so the line between caravan traffic and ordinary town commerce became thin. The stop could therefore become a place where cargo changed hands, supplies were replaced, and the next stage of travel was prepared in one practical sequence. This made the caravanserai more than an overnight shelter. It belonged to a commercial rhythm in which movement, sale, and replenishment supported one another. The city did not interrupt that rhythm, it organized it. A caravan arrived as a traveling enterprise and left as one again, but the interval in between showed how dependent long routes were on nearby economic life. The market did not replace the road. It gave the road a place to meet the everyday economy of the settlement. From that meeting came the ordinary business that made departure easier, because a traveler could leave with provisions, exchanged goods, or cargo adjusted to the next stretch. The exchange was practical before it was dramatic, and that order made the route durable. That practical mix let local sellers profit from passing traffic, while travelers met the ordinary economy that kept the town supplied. Because so much happened there at once, the market made the logistics of the road visible within inhabited space. Goods that had crossed distances became part of a local scene of measurement, exchange, and replenishment. What had been movement across regions now appeared as work done in public. Markets made the road's logistics visible within inhabited space, not by turning the route into a spectacle, but by showing its needs in ordinary commercial activity. The city displayed what had to be carried, what had to be replaced, and what had to be prepared before departure. In that setting, the road did not feel remote from settlement. It became legible inside it. Urban conditions should not be mistaken for the open road, but the city still reveals how the road depended on settled places. The same urban life that handled local trade also handled long-distance exchange, and the two together made the system stable. Nearby and distant commerce met in a way that made both appear normal, almost routine. For travelers, that routine was a form of support. For the city, it was an extension of its own market life. The result was a practical partnership between mobility and settlement, one that turned the caravanserai into a working hinge between the wider route and the local economy. It also showed that the road was maintained in plain sight, within streets and squares where ordinary trade could absorb the burdens of transport without hiding them. The movement sat beside the daily life of the streets. That partnership meant cities did not erase caravan travel, they supported it. The caravan did not dissolve into urban life and stay there. It passed through, taking advantage of what the city could provide before returning to the longer road. Cities did not erase caravan travel, they supported it, and that support mattered on difficult overland journeys. The urban hub punctuated those journeys with a workable interruption, then released them again. The road remained the road, but it was steadier because settlement stood beside it. A city stop could therefore feel like a change of tempo rather than a change of purpose. The purpose stayed the same: movement, exchange, and provision across distance. Yet the city made those things sustainable by bringing them into a managed environment. The practical order of the caravanserai belonged to the road's continuity, not to its ending. Travelers came to rely on that continuity, because without it, the long route would have been far harder to maintain. The city answered the strain of travel with structure, and that structure kept the wider network alive. In that way, the urban stop was not an exception to caravan life. It was one of the conditions that made caravan life possible. The road could cross desert and steppe because towns along it accepted part of the burden, and because those towns were woven into the same commercial world as the caravans themselves. The road's endurance depended on that partnership, since every settled stop reduced the strain of the country outside its walls. So the halt in town was never just a break from the journey. It was part of the journey's own design, where rest, resupply, and exchange could happen under one roofline of urban life. The road beyond still waited, with its distances intact, but the caravan left better prepared because the city had taken on the work of interruption. That is the larger pattern in these stops along the Silk Roads. They did not close the gap between one horizon and the next, yet they made the gap usable. They gave the road a stable interval, and they gave the market a wider reach. In the hours before departure, the traveler stood inside a system where local trade and long-distance movement touched each other directly. Then the route opened again, carrying people and goods onward to another settlement, another pause, and another market. The open road remained outside, but it was never fully separate from the inhabited places that supported it. A caravan could endure only because cities accepted that burden in practical ways, again and again, along the line of travel. The next stretch of the journey depended on that same pattern, and the city held the road in balance before letting it go. What began as a stop for rest became a practical hinge, and that hinge carried the caravan forward without drama into the distances that still lay ahead. By the time departure came, the city had converted interruption into continuity, and the caravan could move onward with less uncertainty. By the time a caravan reached a caravansary, the road had changed from movement into pause, and the pause itself became part of the journey. These lodging houses gathered different languages, ethnicities, and religions under one roof, so the place was never only about sleeping space. A traveler might find people from varied backgrounds in the same enclosure, each carrying different habits, loyalties, and ways of speaking, yet all relying on the same shelter. That contact did not mean social uniformity. The people who shared a roof did not suddenly become one community in every sense, but they did share the practical business of rest, protection, and continuation. In this way, the caravansary stood as a hinge between departure and the next stretch of road. It marked the point where movement had to be managed, counted, and endured. The great overland routes depended on such places because they made the long distance livable. The caravan moved from exposed travel into an organized stopping place, where the diversity of the road became visible without implying a fixed duration or defended compound. It belonged to a wider corridor of mobility, where movement joined one stop to the next and never remained solitary for long. Settled households and nomadic groups met there in practical ways because each depended on the other for transport, storage, guidance, and passage. The caravanserai made that dependence visible without turning it into permanence, and it gave the road a place where exchange could pause before beginning again. The important feature was not just a roof, but the kind of stop a caravanserai created. Once people were gathered inside, the lodging point became a place for exchange beyond buying goods. General social contact and exchange extended beyond the buying of goods, without specifying what knowledge or guidance passed between groups. Because the stop was built for travelers, it supported conversations across languages and beliefs as part of ordinary business. Religious and multilingual interaction belonged to the caravan economy in the same way weights, ropes, and pack animals did. A person did not have to share another traveler's customs to make use of the same space, and that is what made the place so useful. It turned difference into something workable. The building did not erase boundaries, but it gave them a setting in which they could be crossed for a purpose. In a world where distance was measured in effort as much as miles, even a brief exchange could matter. A caravanserai therefore served as more than a roofed yard. It was a node where motion, talk, and accommodation met and became part of the same commercial rhythm. That exchange also linked settled towns and nomadic movement in practical ways, because caravan routes depended on both kinds of labor and knowledge. The stop made room for people who lived by fields or workshops, and for those whose lives stayed more mobile, and it let their needs meet without ceremony. Yet the caravanserai never turned every person into the same kind of traveler. Contact at the lodging point did not mean social uniformity, and that distinction mattered. A mixed roof could hold merchants, pilgrims, guards, servants, and others whose backgrounds differed sharply, but each group still carried its own status and habits. The shared courtyard of movement did not flatten those distinctions. Instead, it made them visible in a controlled setting where cooperation was possible without complete blending. That is why caravanserais could bring travelers from varied backgrounds together without dissolving the differences that shaped them. The place was useful precisely because it could host variety and keep it workable. A merchant might be there for profit, a pilgrim for devotion, another traveler for safer passage, and a local intermediary for the practical labor that tied them together. Their contact was real, but it remained layered. Some people crossed paths for a single stop, while others returned along the route again and again. The result was not a miniature society with one custom and one voice. It was a temporary assembly in which shared necessity overrode distance, just enough to let the journey continue. In that sense, the caravanserai offered order without uniformity, a rare arrangement in a world that often depended on both. Religious practices and multilingual exchange could sit side by side there because both belonged to the ordinary functioning of the route, not to a special occasion. That was the practical social texture of rest itself. The practical value of the caravanserai reached beyond the walls themselves. As a travel node, it linked settled and nomadic communities in everyday ways that kept the corridor working. A town could not remain an island when roads crossed it, and a mobile group could not keep moving without places that understood the needs of passage. The caravanserai answered both conditions at once. It gave the settled side a predictable point of contact and gave the moving side a dependable halt. That meeting was not abstract. It organized circulation, labor, and trust so that people who lived by fixed fields or workshops could connect with those whose lives followed the road, the pasture, or seasonal rhythm. The route depended on that overlap. A corridor of trade was never built by caravans alone. It also required the places that received them, replenished them, and sent them onward. In that sense, the caravanserai belonged to the ordinary infrastructure of mobility. It helped turn distance into a sequence of manageable steps, and it made the Silk Roads less a single line than a chain of interdependent pauses, each one supporting the next. That is why a stop like this mattered even when no bargain changed hands. It held together a larger system in which movement, rest, and renewal all depended on one another, and it let the road pass through communities without dissolving them into the same pattern. The result was practical rather than ceremonial, but it was no less important for that. Within that crowded order, religious and multilingual interaction was part of the caravan economy itself. People on the road had to speak across differences, often enough to make ordinary cooperation possible, and the caravanserai was one of the places where that happened. A traveler could arrive with one faith, one language, or several working habits, and still take part in the shared business of the stop. That did not require anyone to abandon identity. It required a practical skill for living near difference. The ability to negotiate across tongues and beliefs helped a caravan move, because movement in this world was never only about wheels, hooves, or merchandise. It also depended on trust, instruction, and a quiet reading of other people's needs. In this way, the lodging house supported more than rest. It supported the social work that let a long-distance route remain usable. Such interaction belonged to the normal texture of commerce, not to an exceptional meeting between strangers. It was one of the habits that kept the overland corridor functioning across many communities. Traders and other travelers could share a roof without sharing a creed, and they could recognize one another as necessary participants in the same moving system. The caravanserai made that recognition easier because it placed speech, belief, and passage in the same practical frame. By the time the night settled over the compound, the place had already done a good deal of quiet work, and the road had become less forbidding than it had seemed at the last horizon. Seen in that larger frame, caravanserai contact belonged to a wider corridor of mobility rather than to a single building or a single night. Each stop was one point in a moving chain, and the chain mattered because it linked people who might otherwise remain separated by region, language, religion, or way of life. The shelter did not erase those distances, but it gave them a workable crossing. That was the deeper pattern of the Silk Roads at rest, not one settled world briefly interrupted by travel, but a continuous exchange of pauses and departures. A caravanserai made room for that pattern to continue without forcing it into sameness. By holding difference under one roof, it kept the road from becoming a blur of anonymous motion. By preserving the distinctions between travelers, it also preserved the reasons they had come so far. In that sense, the stop was both ordinary and necessary, as integral to the journey as the animals, the loads, and the route itself. When the caravan moved on again, it carried more than goods. It carried the memory of a place where many kinds of people had shared protection, speech, and passage long enough for the road to make sense once more. That wider movement was the reason such shelters remained valuable across long routes and many generations. Their purpose was not spectacle, but continuity, a steady working link between rest and travel, between the people who arrived and the people who would pass through next. By the time a caravan reached a town market, the road had become more than distance. It had become a place where goods changed hands, where travelers could sell what still mattered, buy what their loads lacked, and resupply before moving on. Buying and selling in towns tied long-distance arrivals to local demand, so the market answered the town as much as the route. A load that seemed valuable on the road could prove ordinary once it met the tastes and shortages of a settlement. Different categories of goods entered the same commercial setting and were valued according to distinct calculations within each local market. Resupply and exchange happened together when travelers reached a market, and that made arrival part of the town's ordinary economy. The market was not the whole Silk Road system, but a local point where long movement met urban need. That is why commercial contact linked the road to urban life so firmly. The traveler's burden was not simply unloaded and forgotten, it was reassessed against the daily appetite of the place. In that reassessment, the road briefly bent toward settlement, then back toward farther travel. A market such as this worked by matching movement to the town's own shortages, surpluses, and habits, so the same arrival could mean sale, purchase, and replenishment at once. Local demand set the terms, and the caravan adjusted itself to those terms before the next stage of travel began for both the city and the road alike. Market spaces turned arrivals into exchange choices. Market space organized exchange and temporary pauses without supporting one exact layout or choreography. Exchange sites mattered as much as the road segments leading there, because the built setting redirected movement into commerce. The layout of a market gave shape to decision-making. A traveler did not just pass through. The arrangement of entrances, passages, and workspaces made some goods easier to compare, sort, or resell than others. The city's commercial quarter was part of the journey's structure, not a decorative backdrop. Once goods entered the market, they met buyers whose needs came from households, workshops, neighborhood stores, and the rhythm of settlement. The same space could host offers for food, cloth, hardware, or transport supplies, and each offer changed what a traveler might carry onward. The city's architecture funneled arrival into exchange in the most ordinary way. A market like this did not merely receive traffic, it organized traffic into useful choices. The open passage, the stall row, the gate, and the storehouse all mattered because they helped decide what could be sold, what could be kept, and what had to travel farther. In that way, the market functioned as a hinge between mobility and residence, turning movement into a set of practical decisions that were immediately local even when the journey had been long for both strangers and residents in the same place, and the day's business found its pace there. A market was not an abstract meeting of every possible good. What sold depended on what residents needed, what other traders brought, and what the town could absorb without strain. That made bargaining practical rather than theatrical, and it kept the pace of exchange tied to real demand. A load that found ready demand could be broken up and replaced by supplies that suited the next stretch of travel, while another load might linger until the right buyer appeared. In that sense, the market turned mobility into calculation. Travelers looked for the exchange that would convert a cumbersome burden into something easier to carry or more profitable farther on. Residents, meanwhile, saw the arrival of outsiders as part of normal urban life, not as an interruption to it. The Silk Roads passed through such places by becoming local, even for a short while, and then turning local goods back into movement. Every bargain therefore joined immediate need to wider circulation, one small transaction at a time. The result was a working discipline rather than a dramatic moment. The market rewarded judgment, timing, and attention to what the town would actually take. This was one reason the market mattered so much to people on the move. It offered a place where judgment could be tested against what the town would actually take, which made every sale a practical answer to the next mile. A bargain that fit the local market could change the shape of an entire stage of travel. The town's market brought long-distance arrivals into contact with local producers, shopkeepers, and carriers who understood value through everyday use. That commercial contact did more than move objects. It created a common language of measure, weight, and exchange between people who otherwise belonged to different rhythms of life. The exchange site therefore mattered socially as well as economically, because it offered a place where the road met the habits of settlement. Traders could ask for what a city actually needed, and residents could judge whether distant goods suited their own kitchens, workshops, or storerooms. The market also gathered pricing, sorting, repacking, and deciding what could be carried onward without waste. Even when no one traveled far, the market still felt the pulse of distant movement. The road did not end at the gate. It continued in the prices, qualities, and choices made inside the town. In that way, urban trading points connected the journey to the deeper economy of settlement, where food, cloth, metal, and pack supplies all had to fit a settled order. The social reach of the market lay in that repeated contact, which made strangers legible to one another through trade. In that sense, the market did not merely register exchange, it trained people to read one another across distance and occupation. The road became legible there, not as an abstract corridor, but as a sequence of useful decisions. That is why the same exchange point could matter to a packer, a shopkeeper, or a household buyer in different ways. The same road might feed many such towns, each with its own scale. Local markets never represented the entire Silk Road system, but they showed how that larger network touched ordinary life. What mattered in one place could differ sharply from another, because demand, craft, and household need changed from settlement to settlement. One town might value foodstuffs and repair goods above all else. Another might turn more quickly toward cloth, metal, or transport supplies. That variation kept the caravan from becoming a fixed picture. It remained a moving thread, entering one urban economy after another, and leaving behind only the temporary shape of a trade day. Yet the cumulative effect was real. Repeated exchanges matched goods to use, and that steady matching drew the route into city life without erasing local difference. The road therefore belonged to cities as much as to open country, and cities belonged to the road in return. By the time the market quieted, the bargain had already become part of the town's everyday pattern. In this way, the market preserved difference while also making the route legible as part of a wider world of settlement and exchange. A town that prized grain did not behave like one that prized cloth, and neither resembled a place built around metalwork or transport needs. Those differences kept local markets from flattening the whole Silk Roads into one pattern. They made the route visible as a chain of settlements, each with its own appetite and scale too. From such a market, a caravan moved on with new loads and a different balance of provisions, while the city kept the exchanges it had absorbed. That brief meeting between arrivals and residents is what gave Silk Road's travel its human scale. A distant market was not an endpoint and not a showpiece, it was one working place among many, where road and settlement met, separated and met again. The traveler left with supplies, the town with goods or cash, and the wider traffic of the route continued through both. The next stretch of movement could be lighter, better supplied, or simply adjusted to what the market had made possible. In that ordinary exchange, the caravan's journey took its next shape. What mattered was not a single spectacular transaction, but the steady habit of exchange that let travel and town support each other. The market did not stand apart from the route. It helped the route keep going. What the market offered was not a final answer, but a workable adjustment for the next road. A caravan could leave with supplies that were easier to carry, easier to sell later, or simply better suited to the stretch ahead. The town kept its own gains in circulation, and the road carried those exchanges onward into another settlement. That back and forth gave Silk Road's travel its steady human size, because no journey rested on distance alone. It depended on towns willing to trade with strangers, and on strangers willing to become local for a while. Tang markets brought foreign merchants and skilled migrants into general contact within the city's commercial world, where goods and abilities could meet without fixing one shared setting or list of skills. Chinese buyers and brokers remained present throughout, so foreign presence widened the scene rather than replacing it. The exchange worked because urban rules gave everyone a common framework for price, quality, and reputation. Within that framework, newcomers could find work and local households could find access to items and services that had traveled far. The market therefore linked people from beyond the district to ordinary urban routines where trade was not separate from daily life but part of it. A stall was more than a place to hand over money. It was a social point where skill, status, and practical need met under the same roof. Such markets gave Tang cities a way to absorb outside connections while keeping local participation central. The result was not a blurred frontier, but a disciplined urban setting, busy with difference and still legible to the people who used it every day. In that order, bargaining did not feel chaotic. It followed familiar rules, and those rules made room for strangers who understood the market and respected its forms. Local participation gave the market its steady pulse, while foreign arrivals broadened its reach without displacing the routines that held the city together. Among the goods moving through those stalls were imported silver, glass, wine, and textiles, and the range points to exchange that reached beyond a single luxury taste. Imported categories included silver, glass, wine, and textiles, while no single use, effect, or meaning can be inferred for every item. Their presence demonstrates range in imported goods, but does not fix a universal consumption pattern across the city. Together they show a market where value was judged in more than one way. Practical use mattered, but so did rarity, finish, and the pleasure of owning something that had crossed distance. Sellers and buyers could meet on that broad ground without needing every object to mean the same thing. A bolt of cloth and a vessel of glass answered different needs, yet both belonged to the same commercial world. The variety also says that Tang markets did not depend on one signature import. They gathered multiple streams of exchange into a single urban setting where different kinds of desirability could be tested side by side. A shopper might seek usefulness, while another looked for display, and a merchant could serve either purpose. That made the market wider than a simple supply line. It was a place where color, texture, and sheen could matter as much as durability. Foreign goods did not sit apart from city life. They entered its routines, and their arrival altered what counted as appealing, costly, or refined in the urban world. In that sense, commerce shaped taste as much as taste shaped commerce, and the market became a place where objects from far away learned local manners. Once those objects reached the city, they stopped being only foreign arrivals and became part of ordinary urban life. Market activity brought outside goods into Chinese streets, storehouses, and bargaining spaces where they were handled alongside local products and folded into familiar routines. That mattered because exchange was not confined to a distant frontier. It touched the center of urban experience, where usefulness, price, and standing could be judged in the same conversation. Imported goods did not remain exotic by default. They entered the practical world of gifts, savings, household display, and personal use. A piece of glass could serve as a luxury object, while cloth from farther west could be cut, worn, traded again, or treasured for its finish. Silver could move as payment or adornment, and wine could circulate through urban hospitality. None of this required the city to abandon its own habits. Instead, local habits expanded to handle a wider range of choices. The result was a layered market culture in which the meaning of a thing depended on both its immediate use and the route that had carried it there. That is one reason Tang urban life appears so vivid in trade. The city did not merely receive the world, it taught distant things how to fit inside local routines, and the fit could be practical, decorative, or both at once. Prestige and utility were not separate spheres. They met in the same buying decision, and the market gave them a shared place to matter. The market also helped separate one kind of movement from another. Tang markets supported exchange, but diplomacy and pilgrimage remained distinct reasons for travel. A merchant came to buy, sell, and profit. An envoy moved with political purpose. A pilgrim traveled toward devotion. Their paths could cross in the same wider world, yet their motives did not collapse into a single story. That distinction matters because the presence of a foreign speaker, garment, or cargo does not tell why a person arrived. It shows contact, not the whole purpose of the journey. Some travelers came to make money, some to honor power, and some to seek religious merit. Tang markets supported the first of those aims directly, while the others followed different routes and different obligations. That keeps the scene honest and proportioned. It was a place of commerce first, not a universal explanation for every movement across Eurasia. The market therefore held a practical boundary inside a broad connected world. People could stand near one another, bargain with one another, and still remain tied to separate aims beyond the stall. In a city full of visitors, that overlap made urban life more intricate, not less. Commerce could be hosted without turning every visitor into a trader, and a trader could appear in the same space without trade becoming the only language of travel. The market's clarity lies in that restraint, because it reveals one strand of contact while leaving room for other journeys to keep their own shape. Taken together, the objects on sale reveal movement without proving a single itinerary. A cup, bolt of cloth, or piece of silver could pass through many hands before reaching a market stall, and its presence shows that routes connected the city to wider exchange. It does not tell one exact road, one fixed departure point, or one final stopping place. That is enough to understand the market's shape. The goods speak of contact, but the contact remains broad rather than neatly scripted. Foreign presence in these markets never erased local participation, and that balance kept exchange rooted in Chinese urban life. Buyers, sellers, and brokers from the city remained central, while outside arrivals widened the range of what could be bought, admired, or discussed. The market could therefore display prestige as well as utility. Some goods met ordinary need, and others announced taste, reach, or rank. A person might choose an object for function and still value the suggestion that it had come from farther away. In that sense, exchange worked as social language. It let reputation travel with material things, and it allowed the city to recognize distinction without losing practicality. The market's importance lay in that double work. It moved objects, but it also moved meanings. By the time an item reached the stall, it already carried distance inside it, and the city could turn that distance into status, utility, or both. That mix made bargaining a practical performance of urban order, not a puzzle about origin alone. The Tang period gives this market its proper frame, and it should not be stretched across every century of Silk Road's history. Later periods had different roots, different powers, and different commercial habits. In Tang cities, however, foreign merchants and skilled migrants could meet local buyers in a market that linked exchange to the everyday order of urban life. Imported silver, glass, wine, and textiles show how varied that exchange could be, while the surrounding city absorbed those things into streets, storehouses, and public dealings. The same setting let prestige and utility sit beside one another, so an object could be prized for use, for style, or for the standing it suggested. At the same time, the market did not swallow every purpose of travel. Diplomacy and pilgrimage kept their own directions, and that restraint preserves the shape of the period. The city was open, but not undifferentiated, connected, but not without boundaries. What the market offers is a clear urban picture, not a complete map of the Silk Roads. It shows how commerce worked in one historical moment when exchange was visible in ordinary buying and selling, and when local participation stayed firm inside a wider world of movement. As the bargaining settled, the city retained what it had taken in: goods, tastes, and a sharper sense of its own place within a larger network. The next road led on, but the market had already done its work. Its rhythm belonged to Tang time, and its reach remained distinctly urban. At a distant market on the Silk Roads, bargaining begins inside a wider world already shaped by Sogdian traders. Their merchants formed one influential trading network across Eurasia, and their settlements mark organized commercial communities along the route. That presence gave the market its long reach, but it did not make every traveler Sogdian. The crowd also drew in others moving through the same corridors, each person arriving through a different channel of exchange. In such a place, the market mattered less as a single square than as a meeting point where long-distance commerce could turn into local exchange and back again. Goods changed hands, but so did expectations about credit, measure, and trust. The result was a kind of practical cosmopolitanism built from routine contact rather than grandeur. A person came to the market because another place had already made the journey worthwhile and because enough strangers kept returning to make bargaining intelligible. That is how a distant market held together, not by sameness, but by repeated dealings across difference, with Sogdian and other exchange networks helping the whole system stay legible. In that setting, the price of one object depended on a chain of relationships stretching far beyond the stall before you. Even the smallest exchange carried a history of previous crossings because distant commerce depended on people who expected to meet the same partners again. That expectation made a market durable, and it gave bargaining a patient rhythm that could survive unfamiliar faces, odd accents, and changing assortments of goods. Those settlements along the road were more than scattered way stations. They show organized commercial communities, places where trade could be managed across distance instead of improvised from one encounter to the next. A market connected to such communities did not rely only on chance arrivals. It rested on regular ties, familiar intermediaries, and habits that could survive the journey. That made bargaining steadier, because a seller did not begin from zero and a buyer did not face a wholly unknown world. The commercial network gave form to the exchange, and form mattered. It let people compare weights, judge quality, and decide when a promise was worth more than a pouch of silver. It also meant that a caravan did not simply wander into a crowd and hope for the best. It entered a social system already trained to move goods across long distance. Sogdian and other exchange networks helped organize commerce in ways that linked frontier towns, inland markets, and larger crossings into one practical circuit. In a place like this, a bundle of textiles or a jar of aromatic resin carried more than value. It carried the memory of prior hands, prior routes, and prior agreements, all of them folded into the act of bargaining. On the ground, that meant a merchant could work from known practices rather than inventing each deal anew. The market became a place where continuity mattered, and continuity made distance manageable because people could return to the same habits of exchange and recognize them. That commerce drew more than merchants alone. The mobile world tied to these networks included artisans, diplomats, and scholars as well, each arriving with purposes that could overlap but were never identical. Some came to buy, some to carry messages, some to learn, and some to apply skill in a place where many kinds of knowledge had purchase. The market scene should keep that diversity visible because Silk Road's exchange was never a single trade lane with a single kind of traveler. The same crossing that handled cargo could also carry languages, religions, and entertainment, and those things often traveled together rather than one at a time. A song, a ritual, a script, or a story could move beside cloth and spice, each finding new use in contact zones where people had to understand one another quickly. That made the market more than a place of price. It became a workshop of adaptation where speaking, dressing, and entertaining all met the pressures of exchange. The presence of so many kinds of people did not erase difference. It gave difference a working grammar. Bargaining proceeded within that grammar as a social practice shaped by repeated encounters among strangers who were not strangers for long. A buyer might be negotiating over silk, but the same exchange also carried advice, stories, and reputations from one community to another. That breadth is why these gatherings mattered beyond profit. They joined people who might never share a household, yet who could still share a practical world. In contact zones, goods did not travel alone. Languages, religions, and entertainment moved with them, and that mix changed what bargaining looked like on the ground. A merchant could not separate price from the habits of speech, courtesy, and display that came with each group in the market. A buyer meeting a stranger from another community might read a posture, a phrase, or a familiar object before reaching for a number. That is one reason exchange networks mattered so much. They helped organize commerce by giving people shared habits to lean on, even when the wider world remained diverse. The network did not flatten the market into one uniform culture. It gave enough structure for different cultures to transact. A market with many languages and many affiliations needed ways to make trust portable, so the exchange became social as well as economic, with reputations, intermediaries, and repeated use doing part of the work that force could never do. In that sense, Sogdian and other networks were less like a single road than like a web of practiced connections, each strand making another conversation possible. Bargaining in a distant market depended on those strands, and the bargain itself became one more thread in the web. That is also why the market had to stay legible across difference. Shared habits did not erase local custom, they made room for it. A bargaining ground needed common ground for strangers to continue speaking, and variety so each side knew the encounter it was having there. For the people gathered there, the market also revealed how broad the Silk Road's world really was. Merchants, artisans, diplomats, and scholars all belonged among the mobile groups connected by these networks, yet none of them stood in for the whole road. The same should be said of Sogdian communities. Their settlements and trading role are central to the story. but they do not represent every traveler, every stop, or every kind of exchange. That distinction matters, because a distant market can look complete only when its variety stays visible. If one network helped organize commerce, it did so alongside others, and the scene remained crowded with different interests and different degrees of mobility. Some people moved with caravans, some with official business, some with skills, and some with the desire to join a profitable current already in motion. The market absorbed all of them without turning them into the same figure. Bargaining therefore became a form of recognition as much as calculation. It let participants sort one another into roles, alliances, and expectations, often in a matter of moments. The result was a world held together by contact, not by uniformity, and that is what made its commerce so resilient across distance. That is why no single traveler can stand in for the whole Silk Road story. The road depended on many sorts of movement, and the market displayed that mixture plainly, making difference part of the ordinary business of exchange rather than an exception to it in plain view. Seen this way, the distant market is not a pause in the journey, but a clearing where many paths briefly meet. Sogdian communities belong to that story, but they do not stand for every traveler or every stopping place along the Silk Roads. Organized communities, mixed networks, and recurring movement across Eurasia made bargaining possible beyond the scale of any one town or settlement. Goods, languages, religions, and entertainment all belong to that scene, not as decoration, but as part of how exchange worked. A caravan could arrive carrying one set of goods and leave with another, while the people who handled those goods carried knowledge of who to trust and how to speak across difference. That is the quiet power of the marketplace in a long-distance world. It turns contact into routine and routine into connection. By the time the bargaining ends, the road has already begun to gather itself for the next stage of the journey, with relationships in place that will matter again farther on. That is enough to close this part of the journey. A market where difference is managed rather than erased, and where exchange networks make the meeting workable without making it uniform. For now, the important fact is simple. Bargaining has turned distance into a usable relationship, and the road can keep going because people here know how to make one another legible in this crowded place. Market practice remained local rather than forming one universal day across the Silk Roads. In a distant market, that matters because the trade scene belonged to a connected journey rather than one fixed route. Regional boundaries shaped how exchange became story, and each crossing carried its own habits, tolls, and expectations. The market therefore appears as a local meeting point inside a wider commercial world, where travelers and residents came into contact without becoming the same. Goods moved through a city that already had streets, storehouses, and public spaces, so the caravan entered ordinary urban life instead of hovering above it. That setting gave the bazaar its practical shape. It also kept the picture specific, since no single marketplace could stand for every other one along the roads. The Silk Roads were a chain of places, not a blank expanse, and the market belonged to one place at a time. Even when the route linked distant regions, the terms of exchange changed with the city, the border, and the customs of the district. Movement made the market possible, but place gave it form. That is why the scene stays grounded in locality while still belonging to a larger circuit of trade. The wider network mattered, yet each stop remained its own working world with its own rhythms, measures, and social arrangements. The result is a picture of exchange that is connected, but never generalized into one universal stall-lined day for travelers, officials, and shopkeepers alike, each with distinct expectations. The market itself is known through things, not through a transcript of bargaining. Objects do not preserve a full conversation over price and value, which keeps the scene bounded. Portable goods illuminate contact and commerce, but they do not preserve exact market scripts, so a coin, a textile, a weight, or a vessel speaks for commerce without freezing the words that surrounded it. The built setting mattered because exchange needed places where wares could be shown, checked, and passed along under some shared order. That is enough to see how a distant bazaar worked in practice. Traders and customers met over objects whose value rested on use, origin, and reputation, yet the precise back and forth stayed out of reach. What survives is the framework of contact, the structure that let people negotiate without preserving the negotiation itself. It also points to a market built on repeatable habits, because exchange only worked when enough people recognized the same measures, the same forms of display, and the same expectations about agreement. Such order made the bazaar feel ordinary to those who used it, even when the traffic passing through had come from far away. A market did not depend on perfect wording so much as on enough common ground to let goods change hands. That common ground was practical before it was ceremonial. It tied merchants, customers, and officials to a usable pattern, one that gave bargaining a shape while leaving the spoken exchange unrecorded. The market, then, appears as a working system of objects, measures, and recognized custom. Documents from Dunhuang help describe the texture of exchange, but they cannot stand for every distant bazaar. Their paperwork and references belong to one region, one administrative world, and one set of commercial habits. That is useful, and it also sets a boundary around the story. When exchange crossed into other regions, the forms of trade could shift with language, custom, and authority, even while the wider caravan system stayed connected. A market in one place may have shared broad patterns with a market far away, yet the paperwork, the rules, and the social expectations were not interchangeable. The caravan world was therefore not a single blank map dotted with identical stops. It was a series of regional settings linked by movement, each with its own terms for entry, display, and agreement. That linked pattern explains how traders could travel far and still face local conditions on arrival. A route learned in one district did not automatically govern the next. Customs, officials, and market practice could change at the border, and the traveler had to adapt to the place in front of them. That variety is part of the Silk Road story itself, not an awkward detail to remove. The market appears as both familiar and specific, a place where distance mattered, but where shared commercial habits still made exchange possible enough to continue. It remained local in form even while it belonged to a larger movement of goods and people across roads, ports, and frontier towns alike. Later medieval comparison can help sketch the flow of a market, but it remains comparison, not a merged picture. A later bazaar may resemble an earlier one in broad shape, in the presence of stalls, in the use of measures, or in the pressure to bargain. Yet likeness is not identity. The danger is to let a later scene lend too much certainty to an earlier one. Better to keep the comparison light and disciplined. It can show how crowded exchange areas often organized goods, visitors, and payment, and it can suggest why urban markets became durable meeting points. But the earlier Silk Road setting still kept its own frame. The road network, the timing of travel, and the political landscape all differed from later periods, so the comparison serves only as a guide to general behavior, never as a substitute for the world already in view. That restraint keeps the market from becoming a modernized picture in borrowed clothing. What remains is a distant commercial landscape where motion, regulation, and local custom shaped the terms of buying and selling, and where the market's order was practical before it was picturesque. A useful comparison can sharpen the outline, but it cannot turn one age into another. The market has to remain itself, with its own scale and its own rules. Even when a later example makes the outline easier to see, it clarifies rhythm without pretending that a later bazaar and an earlier one were the same place in outline. Markets also show how mobility connected travelers with settled urban life. A caravan did not float above the city. It entered a place where residents, officials, and merchants already had their own routines. That encounter gave the market its social importance. Goods coming from afar met the everyday needs of the urban center, and the city in turn gave passing traders a setting in which exchange could become regular, legible, and useful. The connection worked because both sides recognized the market as a shared space, even when their interests differed. Travelers brought movement, and the city supplied continuity. The result was not a fusion of worlds, but a working relationship between them. That is why markets matter in the history of the Silk Roads. They turn long-distance travel into something local enough to happen, while keeping the wider network alive. The value of that link does not depend on drama. A market was one of the plainest ways a caravan could enter urban life and leave with something more than supplies. It left with a place in the city economy, however briefly, and that brief placement made the journey intelligible to the people on both sides of it. The market did not erase the road behind it or the road ahead. Instead, it gave movement a social form that settled communities could understand and use. For a time, the market made strangers into practical partners, binding caravan traffic to city routine without erasing either side entirely for a while. The journey stays connected, yet it never settles into one fixed route. Regional boundaries still shape exchange as it moves from one town to the next, and each crossing gives the market a slightly different working order. That is why the distant bazaar can be described clearly only as a local point inside a wider web. It was one stop among many, shaped by its own urban habits and by the traffic that reached it from beyond the horizon. Seen that way, the market is not an isolated tableau. It is the place where movement becomes exchange, and exchange becomes part of city life. The Silk Roads depended on that repeated passage between road and settlement, between the temporary company of travelers and the settled order of the town. The route remained connected, but it never hardened into a single frozen line. It stayed a lived sequence of crossings, each one carrying goods, people, and habits into a new local setting. That openness is the right ending because the market has already shown what it can do. It gives commerce a place, gives travel a social form, and gives the city a reason to welcome traffic that arrived from far away. In that exchange, mobility and settlement meet without losing their separate character. The road keeps moving, the town keeps standing, and the market holds the moment where both are joined. It remains a plain meeting point, carrying distance into daily commerce and daily commerce back into distance again. No single caravan group stood for every overland journey, and that variety matters more than any tidy summary. Some routes linked desert edges, others crossed uplands or river corridors, but the common feature was not sameness. It was movement organized through people who had to read one another quickly, trade knowledge, and make room for strangers. Multilingual contact belonged to that social world from the start. A caravan could carry goods and also carry words, greetings, prices, prayers, and the habits of listening that made exchange possible. Travel was therefore social as well as economic, shaped by companions, intermediaries, and the practical need to keep different communities in motion together. In that sense, the Silk Roads were never only a line on a map. They were a changing human passage, and the variety of the travelers is what gave the route its real breadth. That breadth also reminds us that later labels can flatten what was once more flexible. Keeping centuries and regions distinct preserves the route's true scale. At a caravanserai, the road became a wider corridor of mobility rather than a private string of arrivals and departures. Travelers with different languages and beliefs met within a shared commercial world, and that meeting mattered to the caravan economy itself. Religion, translation, and practical hospitality belonged to the same broad system of movement. Such places linked one journey to another and one traveling group to the next, without making every stop look the same. They turned motion into a recognizable social form where strangers could enter the same built space and move on again with their own schedules intact. The result was not a single pattern of life, but a durable network that extended beyond any one convoy. That larger corridor gave the road its everyday continuity. It also made later comparisons too easy if they ignore the scale of the corridor, because a stop on the road belonged to a long chain of movement, not to a single local custom alone. Markets show how mobility connected travelers with settled urban life, and they did so without dissolving the distance between them. Goods changed hands, but so did languages, manners of address, and expectations about value. That exchange tied moving people to urban rhythms, where caravan traffic met local craft and food. Regional boundaries matter here, because turning exchange into narration can make different places sound interchangeable when they were not. A caravan market in one zone should not be treated as identical to another half a world away, even when the larger movement of trade links them. The important point is the connection itself. Movement did not stay outside the city walls. It entered the settled world, negotiated there, and then moved on with new terms in hand. That is where the road met the ordinary city, and where travel became part of daily urban order rather than a separate realm. Later retellings can blur those edges, but the historical boundary between corridor and city deserves to stay visible. Later comparisons can be useful, but only if they keep centuries and regions distinct. A caravan world in one era does not simply reproduce another, and one regional market is not a shortcut for every other place of exchange. What endures is the larger shape of contact, travel as a social world, multilingual exchange as ordinary practice, and movement as a bridge between road and city. That is why the Silk Roads can close without shrinking into a slogan. They remain a corridor of human meeting where trade, belief, and speech moved alongside one another and then parted again. In the end, the road matters most for the habits it carried between people who did not need to become the same in order to exchange. The journey fades here with its own calm weight, leaving behind the quiet fact that movement once bound distant lives into a shared world and now settles into silence without losing that larger human shape.